The private hospital suite smelled of lemon disinfectant and quiet money. Machines pulsed with soft electronic rhythms while Dr. Richard Morrison lowered his voice to deliver news no family wants to hear. 48 hours, he said, maybe less. On the leather sectional, estate attorneys opened briefcases. On the marble coffee table, memorial service arrangements took shape. Flowers were selected, obituary drafts reviewed. While Thomas Whitmore still drew breath, his ex-wife, Catherine, twisted a silk handkerchief in trembling fingers. His half-brother watched the vitals monitor with patience that felt almost practiced. Then the door to the suite opened without permission. A young woman in worn jeans and a rain-dampened flannel shirt stepped inside, barefoot, holding a mason jar filled with cloudy water, like she was bringing an offering to an altar. Security moved immediately, but she spoke before they could reach her. "This water," she said quietly, "is why he's dying." The room went completely still because she wasn't asking for help. She was bringing truth, and truth carried its own kind of danger. Before we go further, I want you to know something. This channel exists because people like you value stories that matter. Stories about courage when it costs everything. About truth when silence would be easier. If this opening caught your attention, would you do me a favor? Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Knowing you're here, from wherever you are, makes telling these stories worthwhile. Now, let's continue. Sarah Beth Coleman learned early that water could decide who lived and who got forgotten. Every morning before the Kentucky sun burned off the mist, she stood outside the iron gates of Mercy Heights Medical Center. A place so pristine it seemed to exist in a different country. The glass and steel facade reflected clouds like it owned the sky itself. Inside, climate control hummed. Shoes never touched dirt. Outside, where Sarah worked, the pavement still held yesterday's heat and the day before that. Her feet had learned to live with it. She was 19, maybe 20. No birth certificate confirmed it. Her skin was pale in that Appalachian way that spoke of generations in the hollers. She was thin from meals that arrived late or not at all. She balanced a cooler of bottled water and a few mason jars, each wrapped in newspaper to keep the sun from warming them too fast. The water was cheap, colder than the day promised, bought mostly by delivery drivers in idling vans or visitors who didn't want to walk back to their cars. The security guards tolerated her presence because she kept quiet. She didn't panhandle. She didn't sit on the hospital steps. She didn't make eye contact unless someone spoke first. Even so, they chased her off when shift supervisors changed or when a VIP motorcade pulled up and someone decided poverty was bad for the brand. Sarah would cross the street then, stand under the oak tree, and wait. She watched the hospital like you'd watch a living organism. Ambulances screamed in, then rolled out silent. Women arrived hopeful and pregnant. Men arrived angry and bleeding. The VIPs came last. Black Escalades, tinted windows, men in suits talking into their sleeves. Those patients never used the main entrance. They were ushered through side doors, shielded from the world, from people like her. It was from one of the guards, a man who sometimes bought water and sometimes acted like she was invisible, that Sarah first heard the rumor. "Big shot upstairs," he muttered to another guard, voice low. "They're saying he won't make it 2 more days." Sarah didn't need to ask who. Everyone knew. Thomas Whitmore. His face had been on billboards across 3 states, on the business sections of newspapers, on the screens in electronics stores where she sometimes stopped to watch through the window. CEO Visionary, the man whose construction company built interstates, bridges, and municipal water systems. The man people said had climbed out of nothing and then forgotten what nothing felt like. 2 days. The words stayed with her longer than the heat. She sold the rest of her water that morning slowly, eyes drifting toward the upper floors where the windows were darker, the curtains heavier. She imagined the room, the machines, the doctors with their careful voices. She imagined the smell of medicine and wealth mixing the way it always did in places like that. But she remembered a different smell instead. Rust, stagnant water, the sharp chemical sting in her nose when she'd leaned over the creek near her old trailer and seen a rainbow shimmer on the surface that shouldn't have been there. Her chest tightened with the memory. Sarah packed up early that day. She counted her bills twice, then tucked them into the canvas pouch tied under her shirt. From another pouch, this one pressed close to her ribs, she withdrew the jar. It wasn't special to look at, just a scratched mason jar with a rusted lid. The label long gone, the glass clouded from years of handling. She'd washed the outside so many times the surface had dulled. Inside, the water looked almost ordinary. Clear enough, harmless. She'd kept it for 3 years now. People asked her why sometimes, when they noticed the way she protected it, the way her fingers closed tight around it when crowds pressed too close. She never answered them. How could she explain that some things stayed with you not because you understood them, but because your body refused to let them go? She crossed the street toward the hospital gates. The guard saw her immediately. "Hey," he said sharply, "not today." "I need to go inside," Sarah replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. He laughed, short and hard. "Inside where?" "Look at yourself. I need to speak to someone," she said, "about the man who's sick." The guard's face went hard. "Move along." Sarah didn't move. Around them, cars slowed. A woman in heels glanced over, frowned, turned away. A delivery driver rolled up his window. The world did what it always did when discomfort showed itself. It looked away. "He's going to die," Sarah said quietly, "and it won't be from natural causes." The guard stared at her. For just a second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, then his training kicked back in. "Get out of here," he said, "before I call the police." That was when Nurse Helen Martinez noticed her. Helen had been working the early rotation, her feet aching in white shoes that never quite fit right. She was tired in the way sleep doesn't fix, tired of watching money decide who got treated first, tired of seeing families weep in hallways while others argued over room upgrades. She'd stepped outside for air and saw the girl standing there, spine straight, clutching something against her chest like a talisman. "Problem?" Helen asked. "She's making one," the guard said. "Says she wants to see the VIP. Patient." Helen looked at Sarah properly then, not at her clothes, not at the dirt on her bare feet, but at her eyes. There was fear there, yes, but something else too, the kind of urgency that doesn't come from hunger or desperation. "What do you want?" Helen asked gently. Sarah swallowed hard. "I brought water," she said. "It's important." Helen almost smiled, almost dismissed her. Then she noticed how Sarah's fingers trembled, how tightly she gripped the jar, like letting go would unmake her. "Whose water?" Helen asked. "The one that made him sick," Sarah answered. Silence opened between them like a chasm. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She thought of the charts she'd glimpsed upstairs, the way the symptoms didn't quite match, the way certain tests had been delayed without clear explanation. She thought of the family gathered in the waiting room, the half-brother whose eyes never left the monitors. "Come with me," Helen said suddenly. The guard protested, but Helen was already moving. Sarah followed, her heart slamming so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The hospital doors slid open and cold air washed over her skin like baptism. For just a moment, she hesitated. This place had rejected people like her all her life. Then she stepped through. They moved down corridors Sarah had only ever seen on television, past walls that seemed to glow from within, past people who didn't look at her until they did, and then looked away faster. Helen didn't stop until they reached a quiet alcove near the elevators that led to the executive wing. "Listen," Helen said, "I can't promise anything." "But if you're lying—" "I'm not," Sarah said, her voice cracked. "Please." Helen studied her one more time, really looked, then nodded. "Stay close." As the elevator doors whispered shut, Sarah felt the weight of the jar press against her chest. 2 days, they'd said, maybe less. She wasn't here to beg. She was here because the water had followed her all the way to this moment, and she'd finally stopped running from it. Thomas Whitmore had spent his entire life outrunning the memory of thirst. Long before the boardrooms and the private jets, before his name became synonymous with infrastructure across the South, he'd been a boy in eastern Kentucky where water arrived like a rumor. Some days the tap ran brown, some days it didn't run at all. His mother, Margaret Ann Whitmore, used to wake him before dawn to stand in line with plastic jugs. Her hair pulled back tight, her voice calm, even when the line stretched into the morning heat. "Water is dignity," she'd told him once when he complained about the weight. "When you control it, you control who stands tall." Thomas never forgot that sentence. He just learned to translate it into contracts and profit margins. He left home at 17. Scholarships, construction jobs, a mind sharp enough to see patterns others missed. While his peers chased quick money, Thomas studied infrastructure. The bones beneath the skin of cities, roads, power grids, water systems. He built a company that promised efficiency and speed, then another that promised access. State governments trusted him because he delivered on time and under budget. Investors trusted him because he spoke their language. The media trusted him because he didn't need them. By the time he turned 52, Thomas Whitmore was a name you knew across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. A man who could turn chaos into order, who could make things work that hadn't worked in generations. He wore his success quietly, no flashy watches, no yacht photos on social media. He spoke about impact and sustainability with the same tone other men used for the weather. But power changed the shape of his silences. His wife, Jennifer, had been the first to notice. She used to say he listened with his calculator now, not his heart. When she died suddenly from a stroke that didn't care about his connections, something sealed shut inside him. Thomas buried himself deeper into work. He stopped returning his mother's calls as often. He let meetings run until midnight and dinners grow cold. And in that widening space, his half-brother stepped forward. Michael Whitmore was his father's son by a second marriage, a marriage that had loved neither boy particularly well. Where Thomas was methodical, Michael was magnetic. Where Thomas calculated risk, Michael dismissed it with a smile. He'd learned early how to read rooms, how to echo what powerful people wanted to hear. When Thomas needed someone to handle sensitive negotiations, Michael volunteered. When problems arose at project sites, labor disputes, environmental complaints, Michael promised solutions. "Let me handle it," he'd say. "You focus on the vision." Thomas let him. Now, in the private ICU suite that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, that trust hung in the air like smoke. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his world narrowing to beeps and pressure and a deep ache that had settled into his bones. He sensed movement more than saw it, figures leaning close, voices layering over each other like sediment. He tried to speak once, but his tongue felt thick and useless. Somewhere near his bed, his mother prayed in a voice so low it was almost a hum. Her words braided old hymns with names only she and God remembered. She smelled of lavender and stubborn hope. On the other side of the suite, Michael stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the monitors. He looked like a man in mourning, composed, controlled, ready. When the doctor spoke, he nodded with appropriate gravity. When the lawyers whispered, he answered in careful murmurs. He carried himself like someone rehearsing a role he fully expected to inherit. Dr. Richard Morrison reviewed the chart again, his frown deepening with each page. The symptoms weren't aligning the way they should. Organ failure, yes, but not the progression he'd expect. Some markers were catastrophically elevated, others inexplicably suppressed. The deterioration was too rapid, too uneven. "We'll continue supportive measures," he said aloud, because that was the safe language, and monitor closely. Michael met his eyes with practiced concern. "Is there anything else we should be doing, doctor?" The emphasis was subtle, but clear. Dr. Morrison inclined his head slightly. Not at this time. But doubt had already started its quiet work in his mind. Thomas surfaced briefly then, awareness cutting through the fog like a blade. He saw his mother's face first, lined, familiar, fierce with love. He tried to lift his hand, it barely moved. Then, inexplicably, another image rose from somewhere deep in his memory. A girl, younger, standing by a dusty roadside, holding out water with both hands. Her eyes had been cautious but kind. He remembered stopping the truck that day against his foreman's advice because something about the way she stood reminded him of home, of the girl his mother had been once. "You shouldn't be out here selling water," he'd told her gently. She'd shrugged with the resignation of someone twice her age. "People need water everywhere," she'd said. He'd smiled and given her a $100 bill for a $2 bottle. She'd stared at the money like he'd handed her a mystery. The memory flickered, and with it came a sudden, sharp certainty. This sickness wasn't random. Thomas tried to speak. Air scraped his throat raw. His mother leaned closer immediately. "What is it, sweetheart?" she whispered. His eyes searched the room with desperate focus. They found Michael. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable passed between them. "Check the water," Thomas rasped. The words cost him everything. Michael's expression didn't change. "He's confused," Michael said smoothly to the room. "The medication." But Dr. Morrison had heard it clearly. He stepped closer. "What water, Mr. Whitmore?" Thomas's eyes fluttered. The effort was draining him visibly. "The project," he breathed. "The source." Then the moment slipped away from him. The machines reclaimed him with their steady insistence. Silence fell over the suite, thick and dangerous. Margaret slowly straightened in her chair. She looked from the doctor to Michael, then back to her son. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "My son knows what he's saying," she said. "He has always known." Michael smiled gently. "Mom, please." "This isn't the time for this is exactly the time," she cut in. Years of biting her tongue sharpened her words now. "You've been managing his affairs. You've been close to everything. Tell me what water he meant." Michael's smile thinned just slightly. "He's delirious, Mom. The stress, the illness, he doesn't know what he's saying." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat carefully. "I'd like to review some of the recent testing protocols," he said, "and perhaps examine the water sourcing documentation from the last infrastructure phase." Michael turned to him, eyes cooling by a degree. "Doctor, with all due respect, this isn't the moment to second-guess our medical approach." "It's always the moment," Dr. Morrison replied quietly, "when a patient's words suggest something we've missed." Outside in the corridor, an elevator chimed softly. Down the hall, unseen by anyone in the suite, a barefoot girl clutched a mason jar to her chest and waited for doors to open. And in the space between power and truth, the air itself seemed to shift. The VIP suite didn't feel like a place where honesty was welcome. When Helen finally led Sarah out of the service elevator, the corridor had changed. More people stood near the entrance now. Men in dark suits with tablets, speaking in tones that carried urgency without volume. The air felt tighter, as if it knew something volatile was building. "Stay right beside me," Helen whispered. They reached the glass doors of Thomas Whitmore's suite just as voices inside rose above their practiced quiet. "We cannot delay these decisions any longer," a lawyer was saying, his tone clipped. "The board needs clarity and continuity." "If Thomas cannot sign, he's alive," Margaret cut in, her voice sharp despite its softness. "You speak as if he's already gone." Michael stood beside the hospital bed, one hand resting on the rail with studied gentleness. "Mom," he said quietly, "we're only being prepared. You taught us to plan ahead." "I taught you not to rush death," Margaret replied. The door opened then and the room fell silent as Helen stepped aside to let Sarah pass. Every eye turned. Sarah felt the weight of their attention immediately, the judgment, the confusion, the irritation. She stood barefoot on floors so polished they reflected her fractured image back at her. For a heartbeat, she considered turning around and running. Then she remembered her mother on a clinic bench, remembered the smell of the creek, remembered Thomas Whitmore's faint whisper that the guard had told her about. She stepped forward. "What is this?" the lawyer demanded. "Who authorized her presence here?" Helen spoke first, her voice firm. "She has information relevant to the patient's condition." Michael's gaze snapped to Sarah like a spotlight. The warmth drained from his expression completely. "I thought I made myself clear," he said with dangerous calm. "This is inappropriate." Margaret, however, was staring at the jar in Sarah's hands. It was there again, returned to her after samples had been taken, resting against Sarah's chest like a quiet accusation. "Come closer," Margaret said. Michael stiffened. "Mom," I said, "come closer." Sarah approached the bed slowly, her heart hammering. Thomas lay pale against white sheets, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. The man who'd once stood on stages announcing projects that would change lives now looked diminished, fragile. For a moment, Sarah's anger softened into something closer to grief. Margaret reached out with trembling fingers. "That jar," she said. "Where? Did you get it?" Sarah hesitated, her throat tight. "From the creek near the old railroad tracks," she replied quietly. "Near one of your company's construction sites." Margaret's breath caught. Her hand tightened on the rosary she wore. Turn it, she said. Sarah rotated the jar slightly in her hands. There, etched faintly into the glass near the bottom, was a mark most people would never notice. A small symbol pressed into the mold during manufacturing. 3 wavy lines inside a circle. Margaret gasped softly. That mark, she whispered. I've seen it before. Michael frowned, stepping forward. Mom, please. You're exhausted. I am not, she snapped. Her eyes never left the jar. Years ago, when Thomas was still personally overseeing field operations, he showed me paperwork. He was concerned about a subcontractor. That symbol was on their equipment manifest. The suite stirred with new tension. The lawyer cleared his throat. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, many suppliers use similar markings. Enough, Margaret said. The word came out like a door slamming. This girl didn't walk through those doors by accident. Thomas stirred then, a low sound escaping his throat that made everyone freeze. His eyelids fluttered weakly. Sarah leaned forward without thinking, drawn by instinct. It's me, she whispered, though she had no idea why she spoke. The water girl. Thomas's eyes opened briefly, clouded, unfocused, struggling. Then they fixed on her face. Recognition sparked there, faint but undeniable. You, he breathed. The single word carried the weight of remembering. Yes, Sarah said softly. His fingers twitched, searching blindly. Sarah took his hand without hesitation. It felt lighter than she'd expected, more fragile. Water, he murmured again, the word barely audible. Wrong. Michael moved quickly, his composure cracking just slightly. Doctor, he said sharply, this is too much stimulation. He needs rest. As if summoned, Dr. Morrison entered the suite, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes alert. I've received preliminary feedback from the independent lab, he said, choosing his words with precision. Not final conclusions, but enough to raise serious questions. Michael's jaw tightened visibly. Questions about what? Contaminants, Dr. Morrison replied. Substances inconsistent with normal environmental runoff. Compounds that shouldn't be present in groundwater. A hush fell over the room like a held breath. The lawyer shifted his weight uncomfortably. Doctor, these are significant allegations. I'm aware, Dr. Morrison said, which is why we need complete transparency moving forward. Thomas's breathing grew more labored. The monitor began beeping faster, each tone climbing in pitch. Dr. Morrison moved immediately to check the IV lines, then paused, staring at the medication chart with new eyes. This dosage protocol, he said slowly. It doesn't align with standard treatment for heavy metal or chemical toxin exposure. Michael stepped forward, his voice hardening. Are you questioning your own team's decisions? I'm questioning everything, Dr. Morrison replied evenly. The beeping accelerated into an alarm. Nurse, Dr. Morrison called sharply. We need to stabilize him now. Helen moved instantly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. Others followed, urgency finally breaking through the polished calm. In the controlled chaos, Michael leaned toward the lawyer, his voice barely a whisper. Get her out of here. 2 security guards advanced toward Sarah. Margaret saw them coming and stepped directly into their path with surprising speed. Touch her, she said coldly, and you answer to me personally. The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Michael's composure fractured for just a second, something dark flashing in his eyes before the mask slid back. Mom, he said carefully, this isn't helping anyone. This is exactly what helps, she replied, her voice like tempered steel. If my son dies because you were too impatient to hear the truth, I will never forgive you. Do you understand me? Michael stared at her. The suite had gone quiet except for the medical team working over Thomas. Then Michael smiled again, smooth and practiced. Of course, he said softly. We all want what's best for Thomas. As the doctors worked with focused intensity, Sarah was guided back toward the corner of the suite. Her legs trembled now that movement wasn't required. She watched Thomas fight for each breath, watched Margaret pray with fierce concentration, watched Michael stand perfectly still, his hands folded like a man waiting for a verdict he'd already written. Minutes stretched into something thicker than time. Then slowly, the alarm softened. The crisis passed for now, Held at bay by skill and medication, Dr. Morrison straightened, wiping perspiration from his forehead. "We've stabilized him," he said quietly. "But something is very wrong here." "Very wrong." Michael nodded as if in agreement. "Then fix it, doctor." "I intend to," Dr. Morrison said. His gaze lingered on Michael with new scrutiny. "But I'll need complete access to everything. No more delays, no interference." Michael inclined his head gracefully. "Of course, doctor. Whatever Thomas needs." As the suite slowly settled into an uneasy calm, Margaret turned to Sarah. She reached out and cupped the girl's face with a tenderness that surprised them both. "You were brave to come here," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." Sarah swallowed hard against the tears. "I didn't come to be brave," she whispered. "I just came because somebody had to." Outside the suite, phone calls were already being placed. Documents were being quietly relocated, plans adjusted in real time. The girl with the jar hadn't saved Thomas Whitmore yet, but she'd done something just as dangerous in the eyes of those who preferred shadows. She'd forced power to look directly at her, and power had blinked. The 10 minutes Dr. Richard Morrison asked for were not granted freely. They were seized. After the alarms faded and Thomas Whitmore's breathing settled into a fragile rhythm, the suite did not empty. Instead, it contracted. Power rearranged itself in small movements. Chairs pulled closer, tablets unlocked, voices lowered until they carried more weight than shouting ever could. Dr. Morrison stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing the monitor readings with a furrowed brow. He felt the familiar pressure closing in from all sides, the unspoken warning to be careful, to be diplomatic, to remember who paid for the lights and the silence in this place. But another pressure pushed back, older and more insistent. The oath he'd taken had never included a clause about protecting the comfortable. "I need 10 minutes, he said again, louder this time, with the patient's mother and the young woman who brought the information. Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression perfectly calibrated. 10 hours. Minutes for what, exactly? For clarity, Dr. Morrison replied, and for my conscience. Michael smiled with practiced patience. Doctor, you have our complete trust, but this is highly irregular. Margaret lifted her head, her voice cutting through the room like a clean blade. So is planning my son's funeral while he still has a heartbeat. The words landed like a slap across expensive furniture. Michael opened his mouth, then closed it deliberately. He nodded once, slowly. Very well, he said. 10 minutes. He gestured to the others with subtle authority. Reluctantly, the lawyers and advisors filed out, their footsteps muffled by carpet that cost more than most people's cars. The door closed with a soft click, leaving only Dr. Morrison, Margaret, Helen, and Sarah inside the suite with Thomas. The quiet felt different now, less manufactured, more honest. Dr. Morrison turned to Sarah, his expression gentle but focused. I need you to walk me through everything again, he said, slowly, from the EUAV, very beginning. Sarah nodded, drawing a shaky breath. She spoke of the creek near the old railroad tracks, the one that had run clear when she was small. She described how the smell changed after the construction started, how the water took on that strange shimmer, like oil floating on the surface. She described the man she'd seen pouring something from unmarked containers into the drainage channel that fed the creek. She spoke of her mother getting sick, the clinic turning them away, the long night on a wooden bench waiting for help that arrived too late. As she spoke, Dr. Morrison's fingers moved across his tablet, pulling up records. Admission dates, symptom clusters, geographic patterns. He cross-referenced locations with construction timelines. Patterns emerged slowly, like bruises forming under skin. This cluster of cases, he murmured, pointing to a map on his screen. These emergency room visits. Gastrointestinal distress, renal stress, neurological symptoms. Helen leaned closer, to look. We saw some of those patients come through the general ward, she said quietly. They were written off as food poisoning from roadside vendors. Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. Because that explanation is convenient. It doesn't require anyone to ask difficult questions. Margaret clasped her hands tighter, her knuckles white. And because poor people are expected to get sick, she said, it's treated as inevitable. Dr. Morrison looked at Thomas's pale face, then back at the chart. The medication protocol he's been receiving, he said slowly, is standard for organ failure of unknown origin. But if we're actually dealing with chronic heavy metal or chemical toxin exposure, then this treatment is fundamentally wrong. It could be accelerating the damage, Helen finished, her voice hollow. Exactly, Dr. Morrison confirmed. Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. You're saying the treatment is killing him? I'm saying it's not saving him, Dr. Morrison replied carefully. And time is the one thing we don't have. Thomas stirred again, a faint sound escaping his cracked lips. Margaret rushed to his side immediately. My son, she whispered, leaning close. We're here. Thomas's eyes fluttered open with visible effort. He looked confused at first, his gaze wandering. Then he focused on his mother's face, then on Sarah. Recognition passed through his features again, followed by frustration at his own helplessness. I'm sorry, he murmured, the words barely audible. Sarah shook her head quickly, tears burning behind her eyes. You don't need to be. He tried to smile. The expression didn't quite form. The project, he said, each word costing him. I approved the subcontractor. Michael said it was fine. His breath caught painfully. Said I could trust him. The monitor spiked sharply. Dr. Morrison stepped closer, his hand raised. Easy, Mr. Whitmore. Don't push yourself. Thomas swallowed with difficulty. Check the water source, he whispered hoarsely. I ignored the first warning. I was tired. I trusted the wrong person. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, pain and vindication tangling in her chest. You didn't ignore it, she said gently. You trusted your brother. Thomas's gaze slid toward the door, as if he could see through it to where Michael waited. Michael, he breathed. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Silence answered him, heavy with implication. Dr. Morrison straightened his shoulders. I'm ordering an immediate change in the treatment protocol, he said with finality. Supportive detoxification measures. We'll counter what we can and hope we're not too late. Will it work? Helen asked quietly. I don't know, he admitted. His honesty was stark. But doing nothing guarantees failure. Margaret looked at him steadily, searching his face. Do it, she said. Dr. Morrison hesitated only briefly before nodding. He began entering commands into the tablet, fully aware that alerts would be sent, questions would be raised, objections would come. He welcomed them all. Outside the suite, the doors opened abruptly. Michael stepped back inside, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes watchful. Time's up, he said pleasantly. I trust everything is resolved. Dr. Morrison met his gaze without flinching. On the contrary, he replied, we're just beginning. Michael's eyes moved to the tablet, then to Thomas. What are you doing? Changing the treatment plan, Dr. Morrison said, based on new information. What information? Michael asked, his voice sharpening. The kind that strongly suggests your brother's condition is not natural, Dr. Morrison replied, and that delays and interference may have significantly worsened his chances. Michael laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. Doctor, you're tired. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. I'm letting evidence guide me, Dr. Morrison said firmly, as should everyone in this room. For a long moment, the suite crackled with tension you could almost see. Michael exhaled slowly, visibly composing himself. If this goes wrong, he began. It already has gone wrong, Margaret interrupted. Her voice was quiet but implacable, and not because of this girl. She gestured toward Sarah. Because of lies. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, please. Let's not turn this into what? She demanded, leaning forward. A family matter, a business inconvenience. My son is dying, Michael. Thomas stirred again, his eyes opening with effort. He looked directly at Michael, confusion and hurt mixing in his weakened gaze. Why? He whispered. The single word carried decades of trust. Michael stepped closer to the bed, placing his hand on the rail with apparent gentleness. "Rest, brother," he said softly. "You're not thinking clearly right now." "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in months," Thomas replied, his voice gaining a thread of strength. "You wanted control. You wanted me gone." "That's absurd," Michael said smoothly. Thomas lifted his hand with visible effort. "Then explain the recordings," he said. The room went completely still. Michael's expression froze for just a fraction of a second. "What recordings?" Thomas's hand fell back to the bed, exhausted. "The ones I kept," he breathed. "Insurance, just in case." Margaret's eyes widened. "Thomas, you never told me. I never wanted to believe I'd need them," he whispered. "But I wasn't completely blind." Sarah watched this unfold with her heart in her throat. She hadn't known about any recordings. None of them had. Michael's mask was slipping now, the careful composure cracking at the edges. "Thomas," he said carefully, "whatever you think you have, you're confused. The medication, the stress, I know what I have," Thomas interrupted. His voice was fading but determined. Voicemails, text messages, emails about cutting corners, about using that subcontractor even after the first complaints came in, about keeping me in the dark. Dr. Morrison's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. His expression shifted. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly. "The independent lab just sent their full preliminary report. It confirms the presence of industrial solvents and heavy metals consistent with improper waste disposal, levels that would take months of exposure to accumulate." Margaret stood slowly, her full attention on Michael now. "Is this true?" Michael spread his hands, his voice reasonable. "There are always trace elements in groundwater near construction sites. This proves nothing." "It proves enough," Dr. Morrison said. "Combined with Mr. Whitmore's testimony and the source documentation, it establishes a clear pattern." Michael's eyes hardened. "You're making a serious mistake, Doctor." "Am I?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Or are you?" Before Michael could respond, Helen's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. "Security is asking if they should remove." She paused, looking at Sarah, the unauthorized visitor. Margaret stepped between Sarah and the door. "No one is removing anyone," she said flatly. Michael smiled thinly. "Mom, be reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable," she replied. For the first time in too long. Outside the suite, more movement, more whispers. The hospital's administration had been alerted. Lawyers were making calls. The machinery of the institutional protection was grinding into motion. But inside the suite, something had shifted irreversibly. Truth had been spoken aloud. And once spoken, it couldn't be easily buried. Sarah stood near the wall, feeling the room's gravity pulling everything toward a center she couldn't quite see. She looked at Thomas, at this powerful man reduced to fighting for breath. She looked at Margaret, standing guard like a sentinel. She looked at Michael, watching everything with eyes that calculated even as his world tilted. This was what truth did, she realized. It didn't solve everything instantly. It didn't heal immediately. But it forced people to choose, to stand in the light or retreat to the shadows. And right now, in this expensive suite with its machines and its money and its secrets, everyone was choosing. Dr. Morrison turned back to his tablet. "I'm proceeding with the revised protocol," he said. "If anyone objects, they can file their complaints through proper channels. But I'm not waiting for permission to save a life." Margaret nodded once. "Proceed." As Dr. Morrison began issuing new orders to Helen, as the machinery of medicine shifted gears, Sarah felt her knees weaken. She'd done what she came to do. She'd spoken, she'd stood, but the cost of standing was starting to sink in, and she wasn't sure she had the strength for what came next. Thomas's eyes found hers one more time. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Outside, through the glass, she could see security guards gathering, could see Michael making a call with his back turned, could see the future arriving with uncertain intent. The battle wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Michael Whitmore did not raise his voice when he left the VIP suite. He did not slam doors or make threats where witnesses could hear. He did something far more effective. He activated networks. Within minutes, the hospital's atmosphere shifted in ways most people wouldn't notice, but Sarah felt immediately. Not with alarms or announcements, but with whispers. Phones vibrated in pockets throughout the building. Tablets lit up at nursing stations. Messages traveled through channels invisible to outsiders, but their effects rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Helen noticed it first. Nurses who had been moving with quiet purpose now hesitated before entering certain rooms. A supervisor appeared at the station, eyes sharp, pretending to review schedules she'd already approved twice. Security guards repositioned themselves closer to the corridor leading to the executive suites. "Something's happening," Helen murmured to Sarah. Sarah sat on a chair near the wall, hands folded tightly in her lap. Without the jar to anchor her, she felt exposed, as if her story might evaporate if she stopped concentrating on it. She tried to steady her breathing, to slow her racing heart. Across the hallway, a television mounted near the waiting area flickered to life. A local news channel filled the screen, the anchor's voice low and dramatic with practiced concern. Sources inside Mercy Heights Medical Center confirm that a disturbance involving an unidentified young woman has disrupted care protocols for a critically ill executive, the anchor said. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. The camera cut to shaky cell phone footage someone had filmed earlier when security first confronted her near the entrance. The angle was unkind, designed to make her look unstable. Her bare feet were prominently visible. The jar was blurred but recognizable. Her face was clear enough to invite judgment from strangers. The chyron scrolling across the bottom read, "Local woman causes scene at private hospital." Helen swore under her breath. That was fast, too fast. Phones came out in the waiting area. People pointed, whispered to each other. A woman shook her head with obvious disapproval. A man chuckled quietly. "Is that her?" someone asked, not bothering to lower their voice. Sarah shrank into herself, the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She had known this would happen, that truth spoken by the wrong kind of person would be called disruption, would be reframed as noise. But knowing didn't make it easier to bear. A uniformed police officer appeared at the end of the corridor, accompanied by a hospital administrator wearing a tight professional smile. "There she is," the administrator said, gesturing toward Sarah with barely concealed satisfaction. "She's not authorized to be in this area." The officer approached, his expression neutral but tired. "Miss," he said, "we need to ask you some questions." Helen stepped forward immediately. "On what grounds?" "Unauthorized access to restricted areas," the administrator replied quickly, "and causing a disturbance that has compromised patient care." Sarah stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. "I didn't cause any disturbance," she said quietly. "I brought information." The officer hesitated, glancing at the television, then back at her. "We'll sort that out," he said. "Please come with me." Helen leaned close to Sarah's ear. "Don't say anything without someone there to help you," she whispered urgently. "Trust me on this." As the officer reached for Sarah's arm, Dr. Morrison emerged from the suite, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Doctor," the administrator said smoothly, "this young woman has violated multiple hospital policies. We're handling it appropriately." "Handling what?" Dr. Morrison shot back. "She's a material witness to a potential crime." "A witness to what?" the administrator asked with false patience. "A rumor?" Dr. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He understood the trap being set. Any public admission now would be spun as unprofessional, emotional, a doctor too involved to think clearly. Michael had orchestrated this beautifully. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind Dr. Morrison, her presence commanding despite her age and obvious exhaustion. "She is under my protection," Margaret said clearly. The administrator's smile tightened. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all respect, this is a medical facility governed by regulations, not personal preferences." The officer shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "please." Sarah nodded slowly. "It's okay," she said quietly to Helen. "I'll go." "No," Helen whispered fiercely. "Not like this." But Sarah knew this pattern intimately. She had lived it her entire life. Resistance here would only make her the story, not the truth she carried. Fighting now would give them exactly what they wanted, a spectacle they could point to as proof of instability. As the officer escorted her down the corridor, eyes followed her progress. Some curious, some amused, some cruel in their satisfaction at seeing someone brought down. Outside the hospital, the afternoon sunlight felt too bright, almost aggressive. Camera flashes went off like small explosions. A reporter thrust a microphone toward her face. "Why did you lie?" the reporter shouted. "Were you paid to disrupt his treatment? Do you regret interfering with a dying man's care?" Sarah said nothing. Her silence only seemed to encourage them. The officer guided her into the back of a patrol car with a firm hand on her head. The door closed with a finality that made her chest ache. Inside the car, the noise dulled to a distant buzz. She stared at her hands, noticing how small they looked without the jar, how empty. At the police station, the process was efficient and impersonal. Her name was written on forms. Her lack of identification was noted with raised eyebrows and exchanged glances. The charge, trespassing, felt almost laughable compared to what she'd witnessed in that hospital suite. She was placed in a holding area with a metal bench and peeling paint that revealed layers of institutional green beneath. Time became shapeless. She counted ceiling tiles, watched dust motes drift through a narrow window, thought about her mother. Back at Mercy Heights, Helen paced the corridor like a caged animal. "They can't do this," she said to Dr. Morrison. "She didn't do anything wrong." "They can," Dr. Morrison replied grimly. "And they are. Because it's easier than facing what she represents." Margaret sat quietly in a chair near the suite entrance, her hands folded, her eyes distant. She was thinking now, not praying. Years of navigating men like Michael had taught her when faith needed to walk hand in hand with strategy. "This is what he does," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "He discredits before he destroys, makes the truth look unstable so no one trusts it." Dr. Morrison nodded. "The lab results will be delayed again," he said. "I just got word. Someone high up requested additional verification protocols." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Michael." "Who else?" Dr. Morrison replied. Helen stopped pacing. "What can we do? How do we protect her?" Dr. Morrison considered the question carefully. "We keep the evidence secure," he said. "We document everything. And we make sure her story doesn't disappear, even if they try to make her disappear." "How?" Helen asked, frustration sharpening her voice. He looked at her directly. by doing what they don't expect, by refusing to be quiet. That night, while Sarah sat on the cold metal bench counting her own heartbeats, Helen made a decision that would likely cost her job. She waited until her shift technically ended, then walked to the police station with purposeful calm. At the front desk, she presented paperwork she'd carefully prepared. "There's been a mistake," she said to the officer on duty. "The hospital administrator has authorized her release. She's needed for medical testimony." The officer squinted at the forms, which looked official enough with their letterhead and signatures. "These just came through?" "Yes," Helen replied evenly, her voice betraying nothing. The doctor insisted. The officer hesitated, clearly uncertain. Then he shrugged. "Not my problem," he muttered. Minutes later, Sarah stepped back into the cool evening air, confused and exhausted. Helen took her firmly by the arm and didn't stop walking until they'd reached the hospital service entrance, the one staff used to avoid the main lobby. "You're not going back to the ward," Helen said quietly. "You're staying somewhere they won't think to look." She led Sarah through back corridors, past laundry facilities and storage areas, to a small room deep in the oldest part of the building. It was windowless, stacked with extra linens and outdated equipment. It smelled faintly of bleach and old cardboard. "I'll bring food," Helen said, "and updates. But you absolutely cannot leave this room. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Helen cupped her face gently, the way a mother would. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said firmly. "Nothing." As the door closed, Sarah slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest. The world outside moved fast, cameras rolling, narratives forming, power tightening its grip like a fist around truth. Inside this small room, time slowed to a crawl. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The creek as it used to be, clear and cold. Her mother's hands, strong despite everything. The way Thomas Whitmore had looked at her that day by the roadside, really seen her, before his world and hers had collided in ways neither could have predicted. She didn't know how long she could stay hidden. Didn't know if Thomas would survive. Didn't know if the truth would be enough against the machinery designed to bury it. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were afraid of her. A girl with no money, no credentials, no power. They were afraid because she'd refused to accept that suffering was just the way things were. And that fear meant the truth was still alive, still dangerous, still worth protecting. Outside, the city continued its evening routines. Inside Mercy Heights Medical Center, machines hummed and decisions were being made in quiet rooms. And in the space between what was and what could be, a battle was taking shape that would determine whether justice was a privilege of the powerful or a right that belonged to everyone. We're at a crucial moment in this story, and I want to pause and ask you something. If this story is speaking to you, if it's reminding you why truth matters even when it's costly, would you take a moment to share it? Leave a comment about what's resonating with you. Tell someone you know who needs to hear a story like this. Stories of courage and justice only spread when people like you decide they matter enough to pass along. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive. Now, let's continue. Night pressed heavily against Mercy Heights Medical Center, turning its glass walls into mirrors that reflected anxiety more than light. Inside, the building continued its routines with mechanical precision. Monitors hummed their steady rhythm. Medication carts rolled down corridors. Shoes whispered across polished floors. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted, and those who paid attention could feel it. Dr. Richard Morrison felt it in the way colleagues avoided eye contact. He stood at the nurse's station reviewing updated charts, his tablet glowing softly in the dimmed corridor lighting. Each time he requested access to the complete toxicology panel, the response came back identical. Pending review. Each time he asked about the delay, he received explanations that sounded rehearsed, almost scripted. System verification needed, one technician offered. External consultation required, another added. Chain of custody protocols, a third suggested. None of it was convincing. He closed the tablet and looked down the long corridor toward the executive wing. Behind those doors, Thomas Whitmore lay suspended between moments, his life measured in electronic beeps and shallow breaths. Dr. Morrison had seen many patients hover on this edge. What disturbed him now wasn't the medical fragility. It was the institutional obstruction. He turned to Helen, who stood nearby pretending to reorganize files for the fourth time in an hour. "They're stalling," he said quietly. Helen nodded without looking up, waiting for something, or someone. Dr. Morrison exhaled slowly. "Has anyone asked about her?" He didn't need to specify who. Helen shook her head. "Not directly, which worries me more than if they were looking openly." Across the hospital in the windowless storage room, Sarah lay curled on a thin emergency mattress, her body exhausted but her mind painfully alert. The hum of the building seeped through the walls. Every sound felt amplified, the distant clank of metal, the muffled murmur of voices, the faint vibration of elevators moving between floors. She had lost track of time. Her thoughts kept circling back to the same moment, Thomas's eyes briefly clear, recognizing her. That moment anchored everything now. It told her she hadn't imagined any of this, that she hadn't crossed an ocean of humiliation for nothing. The door opened quietly. Helen slipped inside carrying a small tray. Crackers, tea in a foam cup, an apple. "Eat," she whispered. Sarah sat up slowly, her muscles stiff. "What's happening?" Helen hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say. "They're blocking the lab results, and the story is spreading." Sarah's stomach nodded. "About me?" "Yes," Helen admitted. "They're calling you a distraction, someone looking for attention or money." Sarah nodded slowly. She had expected this. "And him?" She meant Thomas. Helen's expression softened slightly. "He's holding steady. The new protocol seems to be helping, but it's slow." Sarah closed her eyes, relief and dread mixing. "Thank you." Helen watched her for a long moment, then leaned against the metal shelf. "You know," she said quietly, "I've worked here 9 years. I've watched powerful people walk through those doors and decide who matters based on insurance cards and last names. I learned how to survive it. Keep your head down, do your job, don't make waves. But tonight," she shook her head, "tonight feels different." "Because they're scared?" Sarah asked. Helen smiled faintly. "Because they're exposed, and exposure makes people desperate." Across the hospital in a private conference room, Michael Whitmore sat alone, his phone glowing in the low light. Messages stacked one after another, updates, confirmations, assurances from people whose loyalty he'd cultivated over years. He read them methodically, responding with calculated precision. "Lab delay holding," one message read. "Admin cooperative, media angle stable for now." "Good," Michael typed back. "Keep pressure on the credibility angle." Another message appeared. "Doctor pushing for independent verification." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. He typed, "Handle it." Quietly. He leaned back in the leather chair, fingers steepled, allowing himself a moment to think. Chaos was uncomfortable, yes, but it was manageable. What mattered was control. And control, he'd learned long ago, wasn't about volume or force. It was about patience, about letting your opponent exhaust themselves while you conserved energy. His phone buzzed again, this time from one of his attorneys, board members asking questions about timeline irregularities. Some want emergency session. Michael stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed, "Schedule it. Better to control the narrative than let it control us." At that same moment, Dr. Morrison made a decision that would cost him comfort and possibly his career. He picked up his personal phone and scrolled through contacts he hadn't used in years. When he found the name he wanted, he hesitated only briefly before pressing call. "Professor Green," he said when the line connected. "It's Richard Morrison, from the residency program." There was a pause on the other end, then a warm voice. "Richard. It's been what, 15 years? "About that," Dr. Morrison said. "I need a favor, and I need you to not ask too many questions until I can explain properly." The professor's tone shifted, becoming focused. "What do you need?" "An independent analysis," Dr. Morrison said carefully. "Toxicology. Heavy metals and industrial solvents, without institutional interference." Another pause. "You're talking about something serious?" "Yes." The professor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Bring the samples yourself. No intermediaries, no paper trail until we know what we're dealing with." Dr. Morrison felt tension he didn't know he'd been carrying release slightly. "Thank you." "Be careful, Richard," the professor warned. "If you're going around your own hospital, there's a reason, and those reasons tend to have teeth." "I know," Dr. Morrison replied. He ended the call and looked at Helen. "I need those samples," he said, "the ones we secured before they could be compromised." Helen nodded. She moved quickly, using service corridors and stairwells she knew intimately. When she returned 15 minutes later, she handed him a small insulated container, properly sealed and labeled. "Be careful," she echoed the professor's warning. "I will," he promised. As Dr. Morrison walked to his car in the parking garage, he felt eyes on him. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the sensation. Security cameras tracked his movement. Somewhere, someone was watching. Somewhere, decisions were being made about how to respond. He placed the container carefully in his trunk and drove into the night. Back in the executive suite, Margaret sat beside her son's bed, humming an old hymn under her breath. Her voice was low and steady, a thread connecting past and present, memory and hope. Thomas stirred. His eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them before recognition returned like a light switched on. He looked at his mother, then around the room with visible effort. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "She's safe," Margaret said, leaning closer. "For now." Thomas frowned slightly, processing. "Michael?" "He's busy," Margaret replied carefully, her tone conveying more than her words, making calls, managing things. Thomas closed his eyes, then opened them again with determination. "I trusted him," he said, each word deliberate. "I was tired. I let him make decisions I should have questioned." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Rest now," she said gently. "You'll have time to speak when you're stronger." He shook his head slightly, the movement clearly costing him. "Don't let them bury it," he murmured. "The truth. Don't let them make it disappear." "I won't," Margaret promised, her voice fierce. "I swear to you." Thomas's eyes held hers for a long moment, searching for certainty. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly and let his eyes close again. Hours passed. The hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, quieter, but never truly still. In the storage room, Sarah drifted in and out of fitful sleep, her dreams filled with water, clear and then clouded, her mother's face, Thomas's whispered words. As dawn approached with its hesitant light, Dr. Morrison returned to the hospital. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes, but his expression carried a new resolve. He found Helen immediately. "The results," he said quietly, showing her his phone. "They confirm it." Helen's breath caught. "The water contains compounds not approved for any legitimate use near residential areas," he replied, "consistent with improper industrial waste disposal, and consistent with everything Thomas has been experiencing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. "This changes everything," Helen whispered. "It should," Dr. Morrison said, "but only if we can get it into the right hands before it gets buried." As they spoke, a figure watched from the corridor's far end, one of Michael's associates, phone already pressed to his ear. "Doctor has independent confirmation," the man murmured. "Yes, verified." The message traveled quickly through the network Michael had built. Within minutes, Michael knew. He sat in the conference room, absorbing the information, recalculating. His expression remained neutral, but his mind worked rapidly through scenarios, responses, countermeasures. "So," he said quietly to himself, "the doctor wants to play. Then we'll play." In the storage room, Sarah sat with her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't know that proof now existed in a form that couldn't be easily dismissed. Didn't know that battle lines were being redrawn around her story. She only knew that the truth she'd carried had survived the night. And somewhere in this massive building, a man was fighting for his life while others fought over what his death or survival would mean. Morning was coming. With it would come decisions that couldn't be postponed, conversations that couldn't be avoided, a reckoning that had been delayed too long. The water had spoken through her. Now it was speaking through laboratory instruments and medical records, through the determination of a doctor who'd remembered his oath, through a mother who refused to let her son be another convenient casualty. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about her mother one more time. Thought about all the people who'd gotten sick and been told it was their fault, their bad luck, their problem to solve alone. "Not this time," she whispered to the empty room. "Not anymore." Outside, the sun touched the horizon. Inside Mercy Heights Medical Center, the real battle was about to begin. Morning arrived without gentleness. The sun rose over the city in pale, filtered light, illuminating streets already thick with traffic. Vendors opened their stalls, buses hissed at intersections, coffee brewed in 1,000 kitchens. Life continued with the relentless momentum of routine. Inside Mercy Heights Medical Center, however, time felt suspended, held in place by documents, decisions, and the weight of unspoken threats. Dr. Richard Morrison stood in his office, staring at the independent lab report for what felt like the 100th time, as if repetition might blunt its impact. The findings were devastatingly clear. The water sample Sarah had preserved contained industrial solvents and heavy metal compounds at concentrations far beyond environmental safety thresholds. This wasn't runoff. This wasn't accidental contamination. It was deliberate disposal, systematic and sustained over months, designed to cause harm slowly enough that patterns wouldn't be immediately obvious. He set the report down and rubbed his eyes, which burned from lack of sleep. Years of medical training had prepared him to deliver difficult news to families. Nothing had prepared him for deciding how to confront institutional power with evidence it would rather pretend didn't exist. A knock sounded at his door. Helen slipped inside, closing it carefully behind her. "They're asking questions," she said quietly. "Administration wants to know why you took samples off-site without authorization." Dr. Morrison exhaled slowly. "And what did you tell them?" "That I followed your direct orders," Helen replied. "Which is true." "It may cost you your job," he said, meeting her eyes. She shrugged with a calmness that surprised him. "It already has, probably. I made my choice." He nodded once, grateful and ashamed in equal measure. "I need to present this to the Medical Ethics Board," he said, "and to the hospital's chief of staff." Helen's eyes widened. "Michael won't allow it. He won't have a Choice, Dr. Morrison replied. Not if I move quickly enough. Down the corridor, Margaret sat beside her son, watching the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Thomas looked marginally better this morning. Color had returned faintly to his lips. The harshness in his breathing had eased slightly under the revised treatment protocol. It wasn't recovery, but it was resistance. She held his hand, warmth traveling between them like a quiet conversation. When Thomas's eyes opened, they were clearer than they had been in days. "Mama," he said softly, his voice rough but present. "I'm here," she replied, leaning closer. He swallowed with effort. "The girl, Sarah, where is she?" "Hidden," Margaret said carefully. "Safe for now." Thomas's brow furrowed with concentration. "They'll try to discredit her." "They already have," Margaret admitted. "But she's stronger than they think, and she's not alone anymore." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I need to make a statement," he said. "On record, before anything else happens." Margaret hesitated. "You're still weak." "The doctor said—" "I know what they said," Thomas interrupted gently. "But if I wait until I'm stronger, it might be too late. Michael's already moving. I can feel it." Margaret studied her son's face, seeing determination there that reminded her of the boy he'd been before success had complicated everything. "What do you need?" she asked. "A lawyer I can trust," Thomas said. "Not the firm Michael uses, someone independent, someone who can't be bought." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know someone, from the church. He handles civil rights cases, whistleblower protection." "Call him," Thomas said. "Now." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Michael entered the suite with his usual measured grace. He wore a different suit today, charcoal gray, chosen to convey seriousness without severity. He smiled at his mother, then at his brother. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked with apparent concern. Thomas studied him for a long, quiet moment. "Clearer," he said finally. "Clear enough to know what happened." Michael's smile didn't waver. "Thomas, please, you need to rest." "I've rested enough," Thomas replied. His voice was weak, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. "I'm done pretending I don't know." The suite's atmosphere shifted instantly, tension rising like barometric pressure before a storm. Michael glanced at Margaret. "Mom, perhaps you should step out while Thomas and I—" "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said flatly. Michael's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is a private business matter." "This is attempted murder," Margaret said, her voice like cold steel. "And I will witness every word." Michael stared at her, something dangerous flickering behind his eyes before the mask settled back into place. "That's a serious accusation, Mom." "It's a serious crime," she replied. Thomas lifted his hand with effort. "Michael," he said, drawing his brother's attention. "Why?" Michael turned to him, his face a study in concerned confusion. "Why what, brother? I don't understand what you're asking." "Yes, you do," Thomas said quietly. "You wanted control. You wanted the company. But why like this? Why not just wait? I would have retired eventually." Michael laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "You're confused, Thomas. The medication, the stress. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in a year," Thomas replied. "Maybe longer." Dr. Morrison chose that moment to enter, tablet in hand, his expression grave. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, addressing Thomas, "I have the independent toxicology results." Michael straightened immediately. "Doctor, this is neither the time nor the place." "It's exactly the time and place," Dr. Morrison interrupted firmly. "The patient has a right to know what's been poisoning him." The word hung in the air like an indictment. Margaret gripped Thomas's hand tighter. Thomas's eyes never left Michael's face. "Tell me," Thomas said to Dr. Morrison. Dr. Morrison looked at the tablet, then at Thomas. The water sample contained industrial solvents, specifically trichloroethylene and perfluoroethylene, along with heavy metals including lead, cadmium, and arsenic, concentrations consistent with long-term systematic exposure. "How long?" Thomas asked. "Based on the accumulation in your system?" "At least 6 months," Dr. Morrison replied. "Possibly longer." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this. "The construction project near Laurel Creek," he said. "That was 8 months ago." Yes, Dr. Morrison confirmed. Margaret looked at Michael with undisguised fury. You knew, she said. You knew the water was contaminated, and you let it continue. Michael spread his hands, his voice reasonable. This is speculation built on questionable evidence gathered by questionable means. I have recordings, Thomas interrupted quietly. The suite went completely still. Michael's composure cracked visibly for the first time. What? Voice messages, Thomas said, his voice fading but determined. Emails, text exchanges, I kept them. Insurance, in case I ever needed proof that decisions were made without my knowledge or against my explicit instructions. Michael's jaw tightened. Thomas, whatever you think you have, I know what I have, Thomas said. Documentation of you authorizing the use of a subcontractor I'd specifically rejected. Records of you dismissing environmental complaints, messages about keeping me, and I quote, out of the loop until the project's too far along to stop. The color drained from Michael's face. Dr. Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression shifted. The board has been notified, he said quietly. They're convening an emergency session within the hour. Michael's eyes hardened. This is a mistake, he said, his voice low. Oh, all of you are making a serious mistake. No, Margaret said, standing. The mistake was made months ago when you decided your ambition mattered more than human lives. Michael looked at each of them in turn. His mother, cold with judgment, his brother, weak but resolute, the doctor, armed with evidence. Then his gaze found the door, and beyond it, the machinery of consequence beginning to turn. You'll regret this, Michael said quietly. I promise you that. We already regret trusting you, Thomas replied. That's a regret we'll have to live with. You'll have to live with what you've done. Security appeared at the door then, not hospital security, but officers in uniform. Dr. Morrison had made more than one phone call during the night. Michael Whitmore, one of the officers said, we need you to come with us. Answer some questions about allegations of environmental crimes and reckless endangerment. Michael's mask shattered completely. Rage and fear collided in his expression. This is harassment, he said. I want my attorney. That's your right, the officer replied evenly, but you're still coming with us. As they escorted Michael toward the door, he turned back one last time. His eyes found the empty space where Sarah was invisible, but her presence was felt nonetheless. The girl, he said, his voice sharp. Where is she? Safe, Margaret replied, where you can't reach her. Michael's expression twisted. This isn't over. Yes, Thomas said from his bed, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute certainty. It is. The door closed behind Michael and the officers. Silence filled the suite, profound and fragile. Helen, who had been standing quietly in the corner throughout the exchange, let out a shaky breath. Dr. Morrison set down his tablet, his hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had passed. Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 73 years. Thomas lay against the pillows, exhausted by the effort of speaking, of standing firm against someone he'd trusted completely. Is it really over? Helen asked quietly. The hard part's just beginning, Dr. Morrison replied. Evidence needs to be formalized, charges filed, investigations conducted, and Thomas still has a long recovery ahead. But the truth is out, Margaret said. That's what matters. The truth is finally out where it can't be buried. In the storage room, Sarah had no idea what had just transpired. She sat in the dim light, knees pulled to her chest, thinking about her mother, about water, about how long the night had been. When the door opened, she flinched. But it was Helen, and Helen was smiling. Come with me, Helen said gently. It's safe now. Sarah stood on shaky legs. What happened? Justice, Helen replied, or at least the beginning of it. As Sarah walked through the corridors toward the executive wing, Staff members watched her differently now, not with suspicion or dismissal, but with something approaching respect, or perhaps recognition. When she reached Thomas's suite, Margaret opened the door herself. The older woman's eyes were red but clear. "Come in, child," Margaret said, her voice warm. Sarah stepped inside hesitantly. Thomas was awake, watching the door. When he saw her, he managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, tears suddenly blurring her vision. "I just told the truth." "That's never just anything," Thomas replied, "especially when the truth costs you everything to tell." Sarah approached the bed slowly. "Are you going to be okay?" "Eventually," Thomas said. "Thanks to you, and to a lot of people who chose to listen when it would have been easier not to." Margaret put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "You did what many wouldn't have had the courage to do," she said. "You stood up when standing up meant standing alone." Sarah thought about that, about the jar she'd carried for 3 years, about her mother dying on a clinic bench, about walking barefoot into a place that had never been meant for people like her. "I wasn't alone," she said quietly. "My mama was with me, and all the others who got sick and nobody listened to. I was carrying them too." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of those words settling over everyone present. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Inside Mercy Heights Medical Center, the machinery of accountability was grinding into motion, slowly, imperfectly, but moving nonetheless. And in that movement, in that first turn of wheels that had been rusted shut by money and power and convenient silence, something like hope began to take shape. The hospital became a crossroads in the hours that followed. By midday, Mercy Heights no longer belonged solely to administrators or corporate interests. It belonged to a moment, a turning point where silence finally broke and truth demanded space. Every corridor felt charged with the weight of what came next. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of uncertainty about how far the revelations would reach. Thomas Whitmore hovered in that fragile space between danger and recovery. The revised treatment protocol slowed the toxin's grip on his body, but it couldn't erase months of accumulated damage. His organs responded in hesitant increments. Numbers on monitors improved slightly, then plateaued, then improved again by fractions. Dr. Morrison watched these changes like a sailor reading weather through the movement of clouds. "We're holding the line," he told Margaret quietly during one of his check-ins, "but the next 48 hours are critical." "How much risk?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear behind it. "Enough to keep me awake at night," he admitted, "but less than if we'd continued on the previous path." Margaret nodded slowly, accepting the honesty. "Then we aren't careful people today either," she said, echoing her earlier declaration. "We do what needs doing." The next phase of Thomas's treatment required more than medical intervention. It required institutional authority, the kind that came with signatures and official approvals. In a conference room 2 floors below, the hospital's medical ethics board reconvened under circumstances none of them had anticipated. The earlier emergency session had removed Michael from any position of influence, but it hadn't granted blanket permission for the aggressive intervention Dr. Morrison was proposing. Policy still demanded documentation. Committees still required formal protocols. The antidote regimen's final stage, the one that carried the highest risk but also the greatest potential for recovery, needed emergency authorization that couldn't be implied or assumed. It had to be written, signed, and legally defensible. Phones buzzed constantly. Legal counsel whispered in corners. A representative from the state medical board joined by video conference, his face pixelated and stern on the wall-mounted screen. "We must consider precedent," the representative said, his voice tinny through the speakers. "This protocol hasn't been widely adopted in cases like this." Dr. Morrison leaned forward, his patience wearing visibly thin. "Precedent doesn't save lives," he said firmly. "Action does. We have a patient who will die without intervention. We have clear evidence of the causative agent. We have a treatment pathway that offers genuine hope. What we don't have is time for bureaucratic hesitation." A board member, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair, cleared her throat. "Dr. Morrison, if this treatment fails, if the patient doesn't respond, or if there are complications, the legal exposure—" "If this treatment isn't attempted," Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice controlled but intense, "he dies anyway, and we'll have chosen institutional protection over a human life. I didn't take an oath to protect institutions." Silence followed his words, uncomfortable and searching. In the back of the room, a young reporter named James Sutton typed rapidly on his laptop. He'd received a tip about the situation from an anonymous source, later revealed to be one of the nurses who'd witnessed Sarah's confrontation with security. James had spent the morning making calls, verifying details, building a story that was becoming bigger than anyone had anticipated. The toxicology results had leaked, not officially, but through the kind of quiet channels that always existed in institutions where people's consciences wrestled with their employment. "May I ask a question?" James said, raising his hand. The board chair frowned. "This is a closed session." "With respect, ma'am, once criminal allegations are involved, the public interest becomes relevant," James replied. "I'm here as a witness to process, not a participant, but I do have a question." The chair hesitated, then nodded curtly. "What is it?" "If you deny this treatment," James said carefully, "and the patient dies, how will you explain that decision to the families of others who were exposed to the same contamination, the ones who don't have access to this hospital or these resources?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. Another board member shifted uncomfortably. "Are there other victims?" "At least a dozen documented cases in the county records," James replied, reading from his notes. "Probably more who never sought treatment or were misdiagnosed, all within 2 miles of the construction site in question, all presenting similar symptoms over the past 8 months. Dr. Morrison's expression shifted to something between vindication and grief. He'd suspected the scope was larger, but hearing it confirmed made the urgency more acute. The board chair removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "This is beyond our immediate purview," she said finally. "But the question stands. Dr. Morrison, what specifically do you need?" "Full authorization for the advanced chelation protocol," he replied immediately. "Access to the specialized medications, and a legal shield for the medical team so we can act without fear of personal liability if outcomes aren't perfect." "That's a significant ask," another board member said. "It's a significant situation," Dr. Morrison countered. The state representative on the screen leaned closer to his camera. "I'll need to consult with the Attorney General's office," he said, "but given the criminal investigation now underway and the public health implications, I'm prepared to recommend emergency authorization." The board chair looked around the table, reading faces, gauging consensus. "All in favor of granting Dr. Morrison's request, pending final state approval?" Hands rose slowly at first, then with more confidence. 6 of 7 board members voted yes. The chair nodded. "Authorization granted. Document everything, doctor, and God help us all if we're wrong." Dr. Morrison stood, relief flooding through him. "Thank you," he said. "You won't regret this." "We already regret that it came to this," the chair replied quietly. "Now go save your patient." In the executive suite, the final preparation began. Helen worked with focused intensity, her hands steady despite the stakes. Other nurses joined, assembling equipment, preparing medications, running through protocols with the kind of precision that came from years of training meeting a moment that mattered beyond routine. Margaret stood near the window, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. She'd called her pastor an hour earlier, asking for the church prayer chain to activate. Across 3 counties, people who'd never met Thomas Whitmore were now interceding for his life. Sarah sat in a chair near the door, watching everything with wide eyes. She felt simultaneously essential and peripheral, like she'd set something in motion that now moved with its own momentum. "You should rest," Helen said gently, passing by with an armful of IV bags. "You've done your part." "I want to stay," Sarah replied. "If that's okay. I need to see it through." Helen smiled. "Then stay. You've earned that right." Thomas lay with his eyes closed, conserving strength. He'd been briefed on what was coming, the risks and the possibilities. When Dr. Morrison entered to perform the final pre-treatment assessment, Thomas opened his eyes. "I'm ready," he said simply. Dr. Morrison nodded. "Your vital signs are as stable as we can hope for. Your kidney function is borderline, but responding to support. Your liver enzymes are still elevated, but trending in the right direction. This next phase will be challenging. Your body will be working hard to expel the toxins, and that process isn't gentle." "I understand," Thomas said, "but doing nothing guarantees failure, right?" "Yes," Dr. Morrison confirmed. Thomas managed a weak smile. "Then let's not do nothing." Margaret came to the bedside, taking her son's hand. "I love you," she said simply. "I know, Mama," Thomas replied. "I love you too, and I'm sorry for all of this." "Hush," she said, squeezing his hand. "You didn't do this. Someone else made these choices. You're just surviving them." The treatment began with quiet efficiency. New medications flowed through IV lines, carefully calibrated doses designed to bind with the heavy metals and solvents in Thomas's system and help his body eliminate them. Dr. Morrison monitored every reading, every response, his focus absolute. Minutes stretched into an hour. Thomas's body reacted as expected, not dramatically but measurably. His temperature rose slightly as his immune system engaged. His heart rate increased, then stabilized. The monitors showed his kidneys working harder, processing, filtering, expelling. Helen checked fluid output, noting volumes and colors that told stories about what was leaving his system. "He's responding," she said quietly to Dr. Morrison. "Early signs are positive." Dr. Morrison allowed himself a cautious nod. "Let's see if it holds." Another hour passed. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his body focused on the work of healing. When he surfaced briefly, his eyes found Sarah. "You stayed," he murmured. "I promised myself I would," she replied softly. He smiled slightly. "Thank you for that, for not giving up when everyone said you should." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "My mama taught me that giving up is easy. Standing firm is what takes courage." "Your mama was right," Thomas whispered before sleep reclaimed him. Outside the suite, the world continued to spin. News of Michael's arrest spread through social media and local news channels. The story evolved rapidly. Local executive arrested in environmental crime investigation. Construction company CEO fights for life after alleged poisoning. Whistleblower's courage exposes corruption in infrastructure project. Sarah's name remained protected for now, listed only as a local resident who brought forward critical evidence. But her face from the earlier footage circulated, and people began connecting pieces, recognizing her, reconsidering their earlier judgments. In the storage room that had sheltered her, someone had left flowers and a note. "Thank you for being brave," it read. "You saved more than one life." By evening, Thomas's numbers had improved noticeably. His oxygen saturation climbed steadily. His blood pressure stabilized in a healthy range. His kidney function showed marked improvement. Dr. Morrison reviewed the trends with something approaching cautious optimism. "He's turned a corner," he said to Margaret. "Not out of danger yet, but definitely turned." Margaret closed her eyes, gratitude washing over her like a wave. "Thank God," she whispered. "And thank you, Doctor." Thanks, Sarah, Dr. Morrison replied, glancing at the young woman, and thank whatever kept her holding onto that jar all these years. Sarah looked down at her hands, still unable to fully process that any of this had happened, that her voice had mattered, that truth had found a way through all the barriers designed to keep it silent. Helen brought her a sandwich and sat beside her. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Sarah considered. "Shock wears off. You're going to need shock wears off. You're going to need support. People to help you process all of this. Will you let us help you?" Sarah met her eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Because you helped us remember why we do this work," Helen said simply. "Because you showed us what courage actually looks like. And because you deserve better than to face what comes next alone." Sarah nodded slowly, accepting the kindness she'd rarely experienced. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Inside, Mercy Heights Medical Center, machines hummed their steady rhythms. A man who'd come within hours of death now breathed easier. A woman who'd been dismissed as nobody now sat among people who saw her clearly. And somewhere in the space between what had been and what could be, healing began its slow, deliberate work. Not just for Thomas Whitmore, but for a system that had been forced to confront its own capacity for harm. The battle wasn't finished. Legal proceedings would take months. Investigations would uncover more victims, more corruption, more painful truths. But tonight, in this moment, truth had won a crucial victory. It had survived long enough to be heard, and once heard, it could never be fully silenced again. The first thing Thomas Whitmore learned after surviving was how much survival truly cost. Not in money, though the medical bills would be staggering. Not in reputation, though his company's stock had plummeted and his name would forever carry the shadow of what his brother had done. The cost came in humility, in the slow, painful recognition of how blind trust and exhaustion had nearly killed him and harmed countless others. Days passed before the machines were removed one by one, each disconnection a small victory. Before the room grew quieter, in a way that felt earned rather than ominous. His body was weaker than he'd ever imagined possible. His hands trembled when he tried to hold a water glass, his voice tired after mere minutes of conversation. Walking from the bed to the bathroom, a distance of perhaps 12 feet, left him breathless and shaking. But he was alive, and that truth settled into him slowly, like rain soaking into ground that had been parched too long. Dr. Morrison stood at the foot of the bed one morning, reviewing the latest blood work with measured relief. "You're out of immediate danger," he said, his tone professional but warm. "The chelation therapy worked better than I'd hoped. Your kidney function is nearly normal. Liver enzymes are back in acceptable range. You'll need ongoing monitoring, but the prognosis is good." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this. "How long until I'm back to normal?" Dr. Morrison hesitated. "Define normal. Physically, you're looking at 6 months of recovery minimum, maybe longer. Your body took a beating, and healing from toxin exposure isn't a straight line. You'll have good days and setbacks." "And the company?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "That's above my pay grade," Dr. Morrison said with a slight smile. "But I'd imagine you have some difficult decisions ahead." Thomas looked toward the window, where morning light slanted through half-open blinds. "I spent my whole life building something," he said quietly. "Thought I was doing good work, providing jobs, building infrastructure, making things better." He paused. "Turns out I was so focused on the big picture, I stopped seeing what was happening right in front of me." "You're seeing now," Dr. Morrison replied. "That's what matters." Margaret sat in her usual chair nearby, her presence a constant anchor. She'd aged visibly in the past weeks, new lines etched around her eyes and mouth, but there was a strength in her that seemed renewed, purpose-driven. "What will you do?" she asked her son gently. "When you're well enough?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Tell the truth," he said finally. "All of it. Every corner Michael cut, every warning I ignored, every person who got sick because I was too tired or too trusting to pay attention, I'll tell it all." "That will destroy the company," Margaret observed, not arguing, just stating fact. "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but keeping quiet will destroy what's left of my soul. And it won't help the people who are still sick, still suffering, still waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to them." Margaret nodded slowly, pride and sorrow mixing in her expression. Your father would have told you to protect the business first, she said. I'm telling you to protect your integrity. The business is just money and contracts. Your integrity is who you are. Thomas reached for her hand. Thank you, Mama, for everything, for not letting them make this go away quietly. I'm your mother, she said simply. It's what we do. Across the hospital, consequences continued to unfold with gathering momentum. Michael Whitmore's arrest had been formalized within 72 hours. The charges were extensive: criminal negligence, reckless endangerment, environmental crimes, fraud, and conspiracy. His bail had been set deliberately high. He remained in county lockup, his expensive attorneys filing motion after motion, all denied. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Documents Sarah had preserved, recordings Thomas had kept as insurance, testimony from subcontractors who'd been paid to dispose of industrial waste illegally and who now faced their own charges, email chains showing deliberate deception, financial records proving he'd profited from every corner cut, every safety measure ignored. The local district attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd built her career on taking down white-collar criminals, held a press conference that was broadcast across 3 states. This case represents a fundamental betrayal of public trust, she said, standing at a podium with the state seal behind her. Mr. Michael Whitmore knowingly endangered the health and safety of hundreds of people in the pursuit of profit. He contaminated groundwater that served low-income communities. He falsified environmental reports. And when his own brother began asking questions, evidence suggests he deliberately orchestrated circumstances that nearly cost Thomas Whitmore his life. Reporters shouted questions. Patricia raised a hand for quiet. We are also investigating the deaths of at least 3 people whose symptoms are consistent with the contamination pattern. Sarah Coleman's mother, Diane Coleman, is among them. What began as corporate negligence may ultimately be prosecuted as manslaughter. In the back of the press room, James Sutton took notes rapidly, his story evolving from local scandal to something with national implications. He'd already been contacted by larger newspapers, network news programs, and a documentary filmmaker. But he was determined to keep the focus where it belonged, on the victims, on the communities that had been poisoned, on the systems that had failed to protect them. Sarah watched the press conference on a small television in a room the hospital had provided for her. After the initial chaos, Margaret had insisted that Sarah be given a safe, comfortable place to stay while everything sorted itself out. The room was modest, but clean, with a real bed, a private bathroom, and a window that looked out over the city. Helen sat with her, both of them watching Patricia Chen detail the charges. That's your mama she's talking about, Helen said softly. Does it help, knowing they're saying her name? Sarah nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. She wasn't nobody, Sarah whispered. She mattered. What happened to her mattered. She was somebody, Helen corrected gently, and she raised someone extraordinary. Sarah shook her head. I'm not extraordinary. I'm just angry and tired of watching people get hurt because they're poor. Sometimes, Helen said, that's exactly what extraordinary looks like. In the following days, a clearer picture emerged of the contamination's scope. State environmental investigators descended on the construction site near Laurel Creek. They found exactly what Sarah had described: improper disposal systems, contaminated soil, drainage that fed directly into the creek that served as a water source for 300 families. Testing confirmed elevated levels of the same toxins found in Thomas's bloodstream. A temporary water distribution center was established. Bottled water was trucked in. Public health nurses went door to door, offering free testing for anyone who'd been in the area. The line of people waiting to be tested stretched for blocks. Many had been sick for months, even years. Many had been told their symptoms were psychosomatic, or blamed on poor diet, or attributed to pre-existing conditions. Many had given up seeking help because help had never come. Now it was coming, slowly, imperfectly, but tangibly. Mobile medical units arrived, free. Clinics opened. Chelation therapy was offered to those who tested positive for heavy metal exposure. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comprehensive, but it was a start. Sarah visited the distribution center one afternoon, accompanied by Helen. She watched families collect water jugs, watched mothers clutching paperwork for medical appointments, watched elderly men getting their blood drawn. A woman approached her, middle-aged, wearing a factory uniform. "Are you the one?" the woman asked. "The one who spoke up?" Sarah nodded hesitantly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My daughter's been sick for 2 years," she said. "Doctors kept saying it was in her head. Now they're saying it's lead poisoning. They're finally treating her." She grabbed Sarah's hands. "Thank you. Thank you for not staying quiet." Sarah didn't know what to say. She just held the woman's hands and let herself cry too. Thomas requested a meeting with Sarah a week into his recovery. Margaret arranged it carefully, making sure Sarah felt comfortable, making sure there was no pressure. When Sarah entered his suite, Thomas was sitting in a chair by the window, dressed in regular clothes for the first time, though he looked thin and fragile in them. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to another chair. Sarah sat, feeling awkward. This man had given her $100 for a bottle of water once, had seemed kind, and then had nearly died from the very thing she'd been trying to warn people about. "How are you feeling?" she asked, because it seemed polite. "Like I've been given a second chance I don't deserve," Thomas said honestly. "But I'm grateful for it nonetheless." He paused. "I owe you my life, Sarah. I know that. And I owe you an apology." Sarah frowned. "For what?" "For not listening sooner," Thomas said. "For building systems that made it easy for people like you to be ignored. For being so caught up in growth and profit that I stopped paying attention to the communities, my projects, affected. For trusting my brother when my gut told me something was wrong." He leaned forward slightly. "You came to me once, years ago. Do you remember? You tried to tell me about people getting sick. I gave you money and drove away. I thought I was being generous. I was actually being dismissive." Sarah did remember. The memory had haunted her. "You seemed kind," she said quietly. "I was kind in the easiest way possible," Thomas replied, "which isn't really kindness at all. Real kindness would have been stopping, listening, investigating, acting." He met her eyes. "I'm done with easy kindness, Sarah. I want to do the hard work of making this right, and I need your help to do it." "My help?" Sarah asked, surprised. "How?" Thomas pulled out a folder. "I'm establishing a foundation," he said, "funded entirely by my personal assets. Its mission will be environmental justice and community health advocacy, specifically focused on holding corporations accountable and giving voice to people who've been harmed. I want you on the board of directors." Sarah stared at him. "I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You know everything that matters," Thomas countered. "You know what it's like to be ignored. You know how systems fail people. You know what courage looks like when you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. That's the expertise we need." Sarah looked at the folder, then at Thomas. "I never finished high school," she said. "I've been homeless more than I've had a home. I sell water on street corners. Why would anyone listen to me?" "Because you were right when everyone else was wrong," Thomas said simply. "Because you saved lives. Because your voice matters, Sarah, whether anyone's told you that before or not." Sarah felt something shift inside her, some long-held belief that she was too small, too poor, too uneducated to matter. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I ask," Thomas replied. As Sarah left the suite, Margaret caught up with her in the corridor. "He means it," Margaret said. "About the foundation, about wanting to change." Sarah nodded. "I believe him. I'm just not sure I believe in myself yet." Margaret smiled. "Then believe in your mother. She believed in you enough to teach you not to give up. She believed in you enough that her memory kept you standing when it would have been easier to walk away. That belief didn't die with her, Sarah. It lives in you." Sarah looked at this elegant older woman who'd shown her more respect than most people ever had. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." "Call me Margaret," she replied, "and thank you for not letting my son become another convenient casualty of greed." That evening, as the sun set over the city, Sarah stood at the window of her hospital room and thought about water, about how it could carry poison or purity, about how it could take life or sustain it, about how something as simple as paying attention to what was happening to the most vulnerable could change everything. She thought about her mother, about the creek as it used to be, about all the people still waiting for someone to see them, to hear them, to believe them. She was just one person, one voice, one girl who'd carried a jar of contaminated water for 3 years because she couldn't let go of what it represented. But maybe, she thought, maybe one voice was exactly what it took to start. Maybe one person refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable could create space for others to speak. Maybe the smallest, quietest act of courage could matter more than she'd ever imagined. She picked up her phone and called Helen. "Tell Thomas I'm in," she said. "Tell him I'll join his board, but on one condition." "What's that?" Helen asked. "We don't just help people after they're poisoned," Sarah said. "We stop the poisoning before it starts. We make them listen before people die." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll tell him. And Sarah, I think that's exactly what he was hoping you'd say." Outside, the city lights began to twinkle on, thousands of them, each one representing a life, a story, a person who mattered. Sarah watched them and felt, for the first time in her life, like maybe she was one of those lights too, small perhaps, easily overlooked, but burning nonetheless. And sometimes in the darkness, even the smallest light could show the way home. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity, paperwork, and learning to navigate a world Sarah had never been part of. The foundation Thomas established was named the Clear Water Initiative, a name Sarah had suggested during one of their planning meetings. "Because clean water should be a right, not a privilege," she'd said, "and because we want to make things clear, transparent, no more hiding." Thomas had smiled at that. "Perfect," he'd said. "That's exactly what we're trying to do." The foundation's first office was modest, located in a renovated building downtown, not far from the neighborhoods that had been affected by the contamination. Thomas insisted on proximity to the communities they served. "We're not going to help people from ivory towers," he had said. "We're going to be where they are, where they can walk in and talk to us face to face." Sarah found herself in meetings with lawyers, environmental scientists, community organizers, and policy experts. At first, she mostly listened, overwhelmed by terminology and procedures she didn't understand. But gradually, she began to find her voice. When a consultant suggested focusing on high-impact litigation with significant media potential, Sarah had spoken up. "What about the people who don't make good stories?" she'd asked. "The ones whose cases are too small or too complicated or not dramatic enough. Do they matter less?" The room had gone quiet. The consultant had looked uncomfortable. Thomas had leaned back in his chair and smiled. "That's exactly the right question," he'd said. "Sarah, what do you think we should do?" She'd thought about her mother, about the clinic that had turned them away, about all the times she'd been invisible. "We help everybody," she'd said simply. "Big cases, small cases, media-friendly or not. We show up for people the way people should have shown up for my mama." That became the foundation's operating principle. Show up, listen, act, no case too small, no person too, no case too insignificant. Helen left her position at Mercy Heights Medical Center 3 months after Thomas's recovery. The official reason was pursuing other opportunities. The real reason was that she'd been quietly pushed out for her role in exposing the contamination, for helping Sarah, for choosing patients over institutional loyalty. Thomas hired her immediately as the foundation's director of community health. "You were willing to lose your career to do the right thing," he told her during the interview. "That's exactly the kind of person we need leading this work." Helen accepted, though Sarah noticed a sadness in her eyes during the first few weeks. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked her one afternoon as they reviewed case files. "Losing your nursing job?" Helen was quiet for a moment. "I miss the patients," she admitted. "I miss the direct care, the immediate impact. But no, I don't regret it. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had stayed silent." She looked at Sarah. "Sometimes the right choice costs you something. That doesn't make it the wrong choice." Dr. Richard Morrison faced his own consequences. The hospital's administration, embarrassed by the scandal and eager to shift blame, had suspended him for protocol violations related to his unauthorized testing. The suspension was framed as temporary pending review, but everyone understood it was meant to be permanent. The medical community's response surprised the hospital. Over 300 doctors and nurses signed a petition supporting Dr. Morrison. Medical journals published editorials about the importance of physician autonomy in the face of institutional pressure. Patient advocacy groups held rallies outside Mercy Heights. The negative publicity became overwhelming. Within 6 weeks, the hospital quietly reinstated Dr. Morrison with a formal apology. He returned to work, but with a new arrangement. Half-time at the hospital, half-time as the foundation's chief medical advisor. "I've spent 20 years treating symptoms," he told Sarah during one of their strategy sessions. "I want to spend the next 20 preventing them. Treating people after they're poisoned isn't enough. We need to stop the poisoning." The legal proceedings against Michael Whitmore moved through the court system with deliberate pace. His attorneys filed motion after motion, seeking delays, challenging evidence, attacking the credibility of witnesses. But the case was airtight. The toxicology reports, the financial records, the testimony from subcontractors who'd flipped on him to save themselves, Thomas's recordings, and Sarah's jar, now officially entered as evidence, a simple mason jar that had become the physical embodiment of truth. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Patricia Chen, the district attorney, met with Sarah several times to prepare her for testimony. "They're going to attack you," Patricia warned her during one session. "Your background, your lack of formal education, your homelessness. They'll try to paint you as unreliable, as someone seeking attention or money." Sarah nodded. She'd expected this. "What do I do?" "Tell the truth," Patricia said simply. "Tell your story. Don't embellish. Don't get defensive. Just tell what happened, what you saw, what you knew. Truth has a power that lies can't match, but only if you trust it enough to let it stand on its own." In the meantime, the Foundation's work expanded rapidly. They identified 47 additional families who'd been affected by the contamination at Laurel Creek. They provided medical testing, treatment, and legal support to all of them. They began investigating 3 other construction sites where similar environmental shortcuts had been taken. They established a hotline for people to report potential contamination. They hired community health workers who went door to door in vulnerable neighborhoods, educating people about environmental hazards and their rights. Sarah accompanied the health workers on their rounds sometimes, back in neighborhoods that looked like the ones she'd grown up in. She recognized the wariness in people's eyes, the skepticism that came from being promised help that never materialized. "I know you don't have reason to trust us," she'd say when people hesitated. "I didn't trust people like us either, but we're here because we care, and we're not leaving until the work is done. You can test us, see if we mean it." Slowly, people began to trust. They shared their stories, talked about mysterious illnesses, pointed out strange smells or discolored water, showed medical bills they couldn't pay for conditions doctors couldn't explain. Each story became a case file. Each case file became an investigation, and each investigation revealed more of the systemic failures that allowed vulnerable people to be harmed with impunity. 6 months after the Foundation launched, they won their first major legal victory. A settlement against a chemical company that had been dumping waste into a creek that served a predominantly African American community just outside the city. The settlement included medical monitoring for all affected residents, cleanup of the contamination site, and a substantial financial award that would fund ongoing health services. Sarah stood with Thomas and Helen at the press conference announcing the settlement. Reporters asked her what this victory meant. She thought about her mother, about justice that came too late for some but might arrive in time for others. "It means people are listening now," she said into the microphone. "It means that poor communities, black communities, communities that have been ignored, they matter. Their health matters, their lives matter, and companies can't just poison them and walk away anymore." The clip was played on news channels across the region. Sarah became a reluctant public figure, recognized on streets, invited to speak at colleges and community centers. She was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but Margaret coached her through it. "You have a platform now," Margaret told her. "You can use it to amplify other voices. That's not about ego. That's about responsibility." Sarah learned to speak publicly without written notes, to tell her story in ways that connected with different audiences, to deflect praise toward the communities she served rather than accepting it for herself. She finished her GED, studying late. Into the night at the foundation office. When she passed the exam, Thomas insisted on celebrating with a small party. Education isn't just about credentials, he told her as they shared cake in the conference room. It's about having tools to do the work you're called to do. And you're doing important work, Sarah. Thomas's own recovery continued, slower than he wanted, but steady nonetheless. He'd sold his majority stake in the construction company, using the proceeds to fund the foundation and compensate victims. The company itself was restructuring under new leadership, implementing environmental safeguards and accountability measures that should have existed from the beginning. His relationship with Margaret deepened in unexpected ways. They'd always been close, but the crisis had revealed strengths in her he'd taken for granted and vulnerabilities in himself he'd never acknowledged. They had lunch together every week now, conversations that ranged from foundation business to family history to theology and justice. I used to think success meant building big things, Thomas told her during one of these lunches, leaving a legacy of projects with my name on them. Now I think legacy is about the people you help, the wrongs you make right, the systems you change so the next generation has it better. Margaret smiled. You're learning, she said. Slowly, but you're learning. The anniversary of Sarah's first visit to the hospital approached. The foundation planned a small event to mark the occasion, not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of how far they'd come and how much remained to be done. The night before the event, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked the quiet streets of the neighborhood where the foundation had helped place her in a small apartment, her first real home in years. She thought about the past year, about how much had changed, about her mother who hadn't lived to see any of it. She found herself at Laurel Creek, the site of so much pain. The cleanup was nearly complete now. The water ran clearer, though it would be years before it was truly safe again. She stood on the bank, remembering how it had looked that day when she'd seen the man dumping chemicals, how her instincts had screamed at her, even when she didn't have words for what she was witnessing. I did it, Mama, she whispered to the night. I didn't give up. I stood firm, like you taught me. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Sarah could almost feel her mother's presence, proud and peaceful. She pulled out her phone and called Helen. I need to add something to my remarks tomorrow, Sarah said. Can you help me with it? Of course, Helen replied. What do you want to say? Sarah looked at the water, at the moon's reflection rippling on its surface. I want to talk about the people we haven't saved yet, she said. The ones who are sick right now and don't know why. The ones who are being lied to, the ones who think they don't matter enough for anyone to help them. I want them to know we're coming, that they should hold on, that help is real, even if it's slow, even if it's imperfect, that they matter. Helen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. That's perfect, Sarah. That's exactly what people need to hear. The next day, standing before a room full of community members, environmental activists, local officials, and reporters, Sarah delivered those words. She spoke about her mother, about the jar she'd carried, about the day she'd walked barefoot into a hospital where she didn't belong and refused to leave until someone listened. She spoke about Thomas, lying in that bed, dying from the very thing she'd been trying to warn people about Dr. Morrison and Helen and Margaret, people who'd chosen truth over comfort. And she spoke about the future, about the work still undone, the justice still undelivered, the communities still waiting. This foundation exists because systems failed, she said, because corporations chose profit over people, because regulators looked the way, because poverty made people invisible. We can't undo what's been done. We can't bring back the people we've lost, but we can make sure it's harder for it to happen again. We can show up, we can listen, we can act, and we can refuse to accept that anyone, anywhere, is disposable. The room erupted in applause. Sarah stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed, and found Margaret's hand reaching for hers. Your mother would be so proud, Margaret whispered. I hope so, Sarah whispered back. I really hope so. As the event concluded and people filtered out, making plans and exchanging contact information, Sarah stood at the window watching the city. She was 20 years old now, or maybe 21. She still wasn't entirely sure. She'd survived homelessness, loss, and a battle against power that should have crushed her. She'd found purpose, community, and a family she'd chosen rather than been born into. The work ahead was enormous. The systems that needed changing were entrenched. The opposition would be fierce. But for the first time in her life, Sarah believed that change was possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. Because she'd seen it happen, she'd made it happen, and if it could happen once, it could happen again. She thought about the jar, locked away in an evidence room somewhere, waiting for a trial. A simple container that had held truth long enough for truth to matter. She didn't need the jar anymore. The truth it represented was out in the world now, alive and growing, taking root in soil that had been poisoned but was learning to heal. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Spring arrived with a tentative warmth, bringing with it the trial that had loomed over everyone for months. The courthouse in downtown Louisville became the center of attention, its steps crowded each morning with reporters, protesters, supporters, and the curious. Michael Whitmore's trial for environmental crimes, fraud, reckless endangerment, and 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter represented more than just one man's prosecution. It had become a referendum on corporate accountability, on whether the powerful could truly be held responsible for harming the powerless. Sarah prepared for her testimony with Patricia Chen, rehearsing answers, learning courtroom protocol, steeling herself for the attack she knew was coming. "Remember," Patricia told her the night before Sarah was scheduled to take the stand, "his attorneys will try to rattle you. They'll suggest you're lying for attention or money. They'll point out inconsistencies in timing or details. They'll make you feel small. That's their job." "How do I stop them?" Sarah asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "You don't stop them," Patricia replied. "You just tell the truth anyway. You remember who you're doing this for, not for yourself, for your mother, for all the people who got sick and were ignored. You speak for them, and that gives you strength nothing can shake." The morning Sarah testified, the courtroom was packed. Thomas sat in the gallery with Margaret, both dressed formally, both visibly tense. Helen sat beside them, along with several families who'd been affected by the contamination. Dr. Morrison had taken the day off from the hospital to be present. James Sutton sat in the press section, his notebook open, his pen ready. Michael Whitmore sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral, his eyes cold when they met Sarah's. Sarah wore a simple dress Margaret had helped her pick out, navy blue and respectful. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no makeup except a touch of lip balm. She looked young and nervous, which she was, but also determined. Patricia Chen called her to the stand. Sarah swore to tell the truth, her hand on the Bible, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She sat down, and Patricia began with gentle questions. "Please state your name for the record." "Sarah Beth Coleman." "Ms. Coleman, can you tell the court about your mother, Diane Coleman?" Sarah swallowed hard. She was a good woman. She worked hard, cleaned houses, took in laundry, whatever she could find. She raised me on her own after my daddy left. She taught me right from wrong, taught me not to give up, taught me to stand up for what's true even when it's hard. "How did she die?" Patricia asked gently. "She got sick," Sarah said, her voice thickening. "Started having stomach problems, headaches. She couldn't keep food down. She got weaker and weaker. We went to the clinic, but they said there were no beds, that we'd have to wait. We waited all night on a bench. By morning she was gone. Stroke, they said. But she was only 41 years old and had never had health problems before." "Where did you and your mother get your water?" Patricia asked. "From Laurel Creek," Sarah replied. "Same place everyone in our area got it. We didn't have city water out where we lived. The creek had always been clean, or clean enough. But about a year before Mama died, it started changing. Started smelling funny sometimes, had this oily look on top. People started getting sick, but everybody said it was just bad luck or poor diet or made-up problems." "What did you do when you noticed the water changing?" "I kept a sample," Sarah said, "in a jar. I didn't really know why at first. I just knew something was wrong, and I wanted to have proof if I ever needed it." "Did you see anything that made you suspicious about the water's contamination?" Patricia asked. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "I saw a man at the construction site pouring something into the drainage channel that fed the creek. When I called out to him, he told me to get lost, that it wasn't my business. But I knew it was wrong. I could feel it." Patricia nodded. And what happened when you tried to report this? Sarah's voice grew stronger. Nobody listened. I called the county environmental office. They said they'd look into it, but never did. I tried to talk to supervisors at the construction site. They ran me off. I even tried to talk to Mr. Thomas Whitmore once when I saw his truck. He was kind, gave me money, but he didn't really hear what I was saying. Not then, anyway. So you kept the jar of water. For how long? 3 years, Sarah said. I carried it with me everywhere. I didn't have much, but I had that. It was proof. It was my mama's story. It was all the people who got sick and couldn't get anyone to believe them. And what made you finally bring that jar to Mercy Heights Medical Center? Patricia asked. Sarah looked directly at the jury. I heard Mr. Whitmore was dying. And I heard he was dying from the same kind of sickness that took my mama. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let another person die when I had evidence that might save them. Even if nobody believed me, even if they threw me out. I had to try. Patricia smiled slightly. Thank you, Ms. Coleman. No further questions. Michael's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Douglas Brennan, stood for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with the expression that managed to be both sympathetic and skeptical. Ms. Coleman, he began smoothly, I'm sorry for your loss. Losing a parent is never easy. Thank you, Sarah said quietly, immediately wary. You testified that you kept this jar of water for 3 years. That's a long time. How can you be certain the water in that jar actually came from Laurel Creek and not from somewhere else? Because I filled it myself, Sarah replied, and I never let it out of my sight. But you were homeless during parts of this time, correct? Brennan asked, his tone still gentle but pointed. Yes, sir. So you're asking this jury to believe that a homeless young woman with no formal education, no scientific training, and no stable residence managed to maintain a proper chain of custody for a water sample for 3 years? Brennan's voice carried just a hint of incredulity. Patricia stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Rephrase, Mr. Brennan. Brennan nodded. Miss Coleman, isn't it possible that in 3 years of moving from place to place, the jar could have been contaminated with other substances? That what you preserved wasn't actually what you think it was? Sarah took a breath, remembering Patricia's coaching. No, sir, she said firmly. I kept that jar sealed tight. I protected it better than I protected anything else I owned, because it was all I had left of my mama and what killed her. I knew exactly what it was. Brennan shifted tactics. You testified that you tried to tell Mr. Thomas Whitmore about contamination when you encountered him at a roadside. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And he gave you $100 for a bottle of water, correct? Yes, sir. That's quite generous, isn't it? Much more than the water was worth? I suppose so, Sarah agreed cautiously. Is it possible, Brennan suggested, that you developed a sense of gratitude toward Mr. Whitmore? That when you heard he was ill, you saw an opportunity to insert yourself into his situation, perhaps hoping for more financial benefit? Sarah's eyes flashed. No, sir. That's not what happened at all. But you must admit, your life has changed considerably since. You brought that jar to the hospital. You now work for a foundation Mr. Whitmore established. You have an apartment, a salary, opportunities you didn't have before. I earned those opportunities, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly, by telling the truth, not by making things up. Or, Brennan suggested, by telling a story that powerful people wanted to hear, a story that would shift blame away from other possible causes and onto my client, who was a convenient target. Objection. Patricia was on her feet. Counsel is testifying. Sustained, the judge ruled. Mr. Brennan, ask questions, don't make speeches. Brennan nodded, unperturbed. Ms. Coleman, you claim you saw a man dumping something into a drainage channel. Can you describe this man? He was wearing a company vest, Sarah said. I couldn't see his face clearly from where I was. So you can't identify him? Not his face, no. And you can't say with certainty what was in the container he was pouring. It looked like chemicals, some kind of liquid. But you're not a chemist. You have no training in identifying industrial substances, do you? No, sir, Sarah admitted, but I know wrong when I see it. Brennan paused, letting that answer hang. Ms. Coleman, isn't it true that you have a history of mental health struggles, that you've been treated for depression and anxiety? Sarah's heart sank. She'd disclosed this to Patricia, who'd assured her it wouldn't matter, but hearing it said aloud in a courtroom felt like being stripped naked. "I saw a counselor a few times," Sarah said quietly. "After my mama died. That's not the same as being unstable." "I'm not suggesting you're unstable," Brennan said smoothly. "I'm simply noting that grief, trauma, and mental health challenges can sometimes affect how we perceive and remember events. Isn't that possible?" "I know what I saw," Sarah said firmly. "I know what happened to my mama. I know what was in that jar. And I know the truth, no matter how many ways you try to twist it." Brennan smiled slightly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Sarah stepped down from the witness stand on trembling legs. Patricia gave her an encouraging nod. As she returned to her seat in the gallery, Thomas reached out and squeezed her hand. "You did beautifully," he whispered. The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Expert witnesses testified about the toxicology results, confirming that the substances in Sarah's jar matched those found in Thomas's bloodstream and in the contaminated creek. Environmental scientists explained how the disposal methods used at the construction site would inevitably lead to groundwater contamination. Former employees of the subcontracting company testified that Michael had personally approved cost-cutting measures that included illegal waste disposal. One particularly damaging witness was the subcontractor himself, a man named Vernon Hayes, who'd accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. He described in detail how Michael had pressured him to dispose of waste cheaply, how he'd been assured that nobody important lived near the site, how Michael had told him to handle it quietly and don't leave paperwork. Thomas testified, his voice still sometimes weak but his words clear. He described how he'd trusted his brother completely, how Michael had handled day-to-day operations while Thomas focused on securing contracts and managing finances. He played recordings of conversations where Michael had deflected Thomas's concerns about environmental reports, had assured him everything was being handled properly, had discouraged him from visiting sites personally because he looked tired and needed to focus on the big picture. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Morrison, who walked the jury through the medical evidence with devastating clarity. He explained how the symptoms Thomas experienced were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, how the treatment protocol had initially been wrong, because the diagnosis was wrong, and how Sarah's evidence had literally saved Thomas's life. Without her intervention, Dr. Morrison testified, Mr. Whitmore would have died within days. The treatment we were providing, while appropriate for organ failure of unknown origin, was actually accelerating the damage from toxin exposure. We were, unknowingly, contributing to his death. Sarah Coleman's courage and persistence forced us to look at the situation differently, to test for things we hadn't considered, and to ultimately identify the real cause of his illness in time to save him. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense presented its arguments. They suggested that the contamination, if it existed, could have come from multiple sources. They argued that Michael had relied on expert contractors and couldn't be held responsible for their independent decisions. They painted him as a scapegoat for systemic failures in environmental regulation. But their case felt thin against the weight of evidence, the recordings, the testimony, the scientific data, the jar of water that Sarah had preserved for 3 years, now confirmed by multiple independent labs to contain exactly what she'd always said it contained. The closing arguments came in late April, as spring bloomed fully outside the courthouse windows. Patricia Chen spoke last, her voice measured but passionate. "This case is about choices," she told the jury. Michael Whitmore chose profit over people. He chose to cut corners, to ignore warnings, to silence concerns. He chose to dispose of toxic waste in ways he knew were dangerous because it was cheaper than doing it right. And when people got sick, when they died, he chose to cover it up rather than take responsibility. She pointed to where Sarah sat. Sarah Coleman is not a scientist. She's not a lawyer or a doctor or an investigator. She's a young woman who saw something wrong and refused to look away. She's a daughter who lost her mother and carried that grief and that evidence for 3 years because she believed, against all odds, that eventually someone would listen. Eventually, truth would matter. Patricia turned back to the jury. The defense wants you to believe this is complicated, that industrial processes are complex and blame is hard to assign. but it's not complicated. Michael Whitmore knew what he was doing. He knew it was dangerous. He did it anyway, and people died. That's not complex. That's criminal. And it's time, finally, to hold him accountable. The jury deliberated for 2 days. During those 48 hours, Sarah barely slept. She walked the city streets, sat in churches, visited Laurel Creek where the cleanup continued. On the afternoon of the second day, word came that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled rapidly. Sarah sat between Thomas and Margaret, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Michael sat at the defense table, his face unreadable. The jury filed in, not looking at the defendant, which everyone knew was a bad sign for the defense. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the forewoman replied. She handed a paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The judge read it, his expression neutral, then handed it back. "The defendant will rise." Michael stood, his attorney beside him. "On the count of reckless endangerment, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Margaret gripped Sarah's hand. "On the count of environmental crimes in violation of the Clean Water Act, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the count of fraud and conspiracy, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear. "On the count of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Diane Coleman, how do you find?" There was a pause that seemed to last forever. "Guilty, Your Honor." Sarah's breath left her body in a rush. Tears streamed down her face. Margaret pulled her close, and Thomas put his arm around both of them. The verdicts continued. Guilty on all counts. Michael's face finally cracked, rage and disbelief flashing across his features before his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later. As the courtroom emptied, Patricia approached Sarah. "You did it," she said simply. "Your testimony mattered. Your courage mattered. Justice was done today because you refused to stay silent." Sarah could only nod, too overwhelmed for words. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Sarah stood on the steps with Thomas, Margaret, Helen, and Dr. Morrison behind her. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. "Ms. Coleman, how do you feel about the verdict?" a reporter called. Sarah took a deep breath. "I feel like my mama can finally rest," she said. "I feel like maybe other people who've been hurt and ignored will see this and know that their voices matter too. That justice is possible, even when it seems impossible. Even when you're nobody standing up against somebody, truth matters, people matter, and sometimes if you hold on long enough, if you refuse to give up, the world will finally listen." The clip played on every news channel that night. Sarah's words echoed across social media. And somewhere, in communities where people had been poisoned, ignored, told their problems didn't matter, those words took root like seeds in fertile ground. The trial was over. But the work of justice, the long, hard work of changing systems and healing communities, was just beginning. And Sarah, who'd once been invisible, who'd sold water on street corners and slept in shelters, stood at the center of it all. Not because she'd sought power or recognition, but because she'd simply refused to accept that her mother's death and the suffering of people like her was supposed to be normal. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world. One person who says no. One voice that won't be silent. One jar of water held tight for 3 years, waiting for the moment when truth finally matters more than convenience. That moment had come, and nothing would ever be quite the same. 6 months after the verdict, Sarah stood at the edge of Laurel Creek watching the water flow with a clarity it hadn't possessed in years. The cleanup was complete now. Independent testing confirmed that contamination levels had dropped to safe ranges. Families who'd been displaced during the remediation were beginning to return to their homes. The creek would never be exactly what it once was, but it was healing. And healing, Sarah had learned, was often the best you could hope for. A bench had been installed near the water's edge, a simple wooden structure with a small plaque, in memory of Diane Coleman and all those whose suffering was ignored. May we never forget. May we always listen. Sarah sat on the bench, her fingers tracing the engraved letters of her mother's name. She came here often, especially when the work at the foundation felt overwhelming, when the scope of environmental injustice across the region threatened to crush her with its enormity. This place reminded her why she'd started. who she was fighting for. Margaret found her there, approaching slowly with 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town. She handed one to Sarah and sat beside her with a contented sigh. "I thought I might find you here," Margaret said. "Needed to think," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sentencing is tomorrow." Michael's sentencing hearing had been scheduled and rescheduled 3 times due to various legal motions, but tomorrow it would finally happen. 15 to 25 years the prosecution was recommending. Michael's attorneys were arguing for leniency, citing his previously clean record, his contributions to the community, his family circumstances. "Are you going to attend?" Margaret asked. Sarah nodded. "I need to. For Mama, and for closure, I guess." "How are you feeling about it?" Sarah considered the question. "Honestly, I don't feel much about Michael anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not satisfied. I'm just tired of him taking up space in my head. I want to move on to helping people who are still suffering, not dwelling on punishing someone who's already lost everything that mattered to him." Margaret smiled. "That's wisdom beyond your years." "Grief ages you fast," Sarah said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Thomas wanted me to tell you something. He didn't want to pressure you, but the board meeting is next week, and there's a decision that needs your input." Sarah turned to her. "What kind of decision?" "The foundation has grown faster than anyone anticipated," Margaret explained. "We're getting requests from communities in 6 states now. We've identified contamination sites in Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, and North Carolina. The work is expanding beyond what our current structure can handle." "That's good, isn't it?" Sarah asked. "It means people are finding us, trusting us." "It is good," Margaret agreed, "but it means we need to scale up. Hire more staff, open regional offices. And Thomas thinks we need someone to coordinate it all, someone who understands the mission from the ground up, someone people trust." Sarah's stomach tightened. "He wants me to do it?" "He's offering," Margaret clarified, "as executive director, with a real salary, benefits, support staff. You'd still be learning, but you'd have people to help you. Legal advisors, operations managers, financial experts. Your job would be to keep us honest, keep us focused on the communities we serve, make sure we never lose sight of the people behind the case files." Sarah stared at the creek, overwhelmed. "I'm 21 years old. I barely finished my GED. How can I run an organization like that?" "The same way you've done everything else," Margaret said gently, "with courage, honesty, and refusal to accept that things can't change. You won't be doing it alone, Sarah. You'll have a team. But the foundation needs someone at the helm who remembers what it's like to be ignored, to be powerless, to have to fight just to be heard. That's not something you can learn in business school. That's lived experience. And it's invaluable." Sarah thought about it, thought about all the people she'd met in the past year through the foundation's work. The single mother in eastern Kentucky whose children had lead poisoning from contaminated well water. The elderly man in West Virginia dying from cancer caused by chemicals dumped near his home 40 years ago. The Native American community in North Carolina fighting a pipeline that threatened their water source. She thought about her mother, who'd never had anyone fight for her. "I'll think about it," Sarah said finally. "That's all we ask," Margaret replied. The sentencing hearing the next day was mercifully brief. Michael's attorneys made their arguments for leniency. Patricia Chen countered with victim impact statements from families who'd lost loved ones or suffered permanent health damage. Thomas didn't attend, unable to face his brother even now, but he'd submitted a written statement that the judge read aloud. "My brother's choices didn't just harm strangers," the statement read. "They nearly killed me. They destroyed our family. They betrayed everything our mother taught us about integrity and responsibility. I don't hate Michael, but I can't forgive what he did, and I believe he must face the full consequences of his actions so that others in positions of power understand that human lives are not acceptable collateral damage for profit." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Elizabeth Harmon, listened to everything carefully. Then she delivered her ruling. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, looking directly at Michael, "you had every advantage: education, opportunity, family support, professional success. You could have used those advantages to do tremendous good. Instead, you used them to cut corners, maximize profits, and when people suffered as a result, you covered it up. You showed no remorse until you were caught. You showed no concern for your victims until you faced consequences. This court sentences you to 20 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years served. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to all identified victims in amounts to be determined by a separate hearing. You will be barred from serving in any corporate leadership position upon your release. May you use this time to reflect on the harm you've caused and the lives you've destroyed. Michael's face went pale. His attorneys immediately began discussing appeals, but Sarah, watching from the gallery, felt something release inside her. It was done. Not perfectly, not in a way that would bring back her mother or undo the suffering, but done nonetheless. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real. Outside the courthouse, the media presence had diminished. The story was no longer new, the verdict already delivered. But a few reporters remained, and they approached Sarah as she emerged. "Ms. Coleman," one of them called, "do you feel justice was served today?" Sarah paused on the steps, thinking carefully before answering. "Justice for my mama can't really be served," she said honestly. "She's gone, and nothing changes that. But accountability was served today. A message was sent that powerful people can't harm vulnerable communities without consequences. That's important. That's something." "What's next for you?" another reporter asked. Sarah smiled slightly. "More work. There are communities all over this region, all over this country, dealing with what we dealt with. Contaminated water, poisoned land, sick children, and nobody listening. As long as that's happening, there's work to do." "Do you consider yourself an activist now?" the reporter pressed. Sarah thought about that label. It felt too big, too formal for who she was. "I consider myself someone who won't look away," she said finally. "That's all. I see suffering, and I can't pretend I don't. I know injustice when I encounter it, and I can't stay silent. If that makes me an activist, fine. But mostly it just makes me someone who remembers what it felt like to be invisible and refuses to let other people stay invisible too." That clip, like so many before it, circulated widely. But Sarah was learning not to pay too much attention to the media coverage, to the public perception. What mattered was the work. 2 weeks later, Sarah accepted the position as executive director of the Clear Water Initiative. Her first official act was to hire 3 community organizers from the regions where contamination had been identified. People who knew the areas intimately, who were trusted by residents, who could bridge the gap between the foundation's resources and the community's needs. Her second act was to establish a whistleblower protection fund, providing legal and financial support to employees of corporations who came forward with evidence of environmental crimes. "We can't wait for disasters to happen and then respond," she told the board during her first official meeting as director. "We need to prevent them, and that means making it safer for people inside these companies to speak up when they see something wrong." Thomas listened to her present her vision for the foundation's future, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope untainted by cynicism. This young woman who'd walked barefoot into his hospital room with a jar of contaminated water had become a leader, a voice, a force for change that was rippling outward in ways none of them could have predicted. The foundation grew steadily over the following year. They opened offices in 3 states. They won settlements that funded medical care for hundreds of affected families. They successfully lobbied for stronger environmental regulations in Kentucky and Tennessee. They trained community health workers who could identify early warning signs of contamination. But the work Sarah was proudest of was quieter, less visible. It was the individual families they helped, the single case that wouldn't make headlines but would change someone's life. The elderly woman in Appalachia who finally got clean water piped to her home after 60 years of hauling it from a contaminated creek. The young father whose medical bills were paid so he could get treatment for the cancer caused by industrial pollution near his childhood home. The community that learned they had rights, that they could demand accountability, that their lives mattered. One evening, almost 2 years after the trial, Sarah sat in the foundation's main office reviewing case files. It was late, past midnight, and she should have gone home hours ago. But there was always more to do, Always another family reaching out, always another contamination site to investigate. Helen found her there, still working by lamplight. "Go home, Sarah," Helen said gently. "The work will be here tomorrow." "There's so much of it," Sarah said, rubbing her tired eyes. "Every time we help one community, 3 more reach out. Every time we think we're getting ahead, we discover another contaminated site, another cover-up, another group of people who've been suffering in silence." "You can't save everyone," Helen said, sitting down beside her. "I know," Sarah replied, "but I have to try to save someone, every day. Otherwise, what was Mama's death for? What was all of this for?" Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your Mama's death wasn't for anything. It was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened. But what you've done with that tragedy, how you've transformed that grief into action that helps others, that's everything. That's how we honor the people we've lost. Not by saving everyone, but by refusing to accept that their suffering was meaningless." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of seeing suffering, tired of the weight of responsibility she'd somehow acquired. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked. "No," Helen said honestly, "but you get stronger, and you learn to share the weight. You're not alone in this work anymore, Sarah. You have a team. Let us carry some of it." Sarah nodded, finally closing her laptop. "Okay," she said, "I'll go home, get some rest, start again tomorrow." "That's all any of us can do," Helen replied. As Sarah walked to her car in the parking lot, she looked up at the night sky. The city lights made it hard to see stars, but she could make out a few through the light pollution. She thought about her mother, wondered if there was anything after death, if Diane could see what her daughter had become. "I'm still standing, Mama," she whispered to the darkness, "still fighting, still refusing to give up, just like you taught me." The wind rustled through nearby trees, and Sarah chose to believe it was an answer. She drove home through quiet streets, past neighborhoods rich and poor, past the hospital where this had all begun, past Laurel Creek where the water ran clear under moonlight. Her apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books now, with photos of people she'd helped, with reminders of why the work mattered. She'd come so far from the girl who sold water on street corners, who slept in shelters, who carried a jar of contaminated water because she had nothing else. But in fundamental ways, she was still that girl, still stubborn, still determined, still refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable or that justice was only for the privileged. She made herself tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city. Tomorrow there would be more work, more families needing help, more fights against corporations and bureaucracies, more moments of frustration and small victories. But tonight, she let herself rest. Let herself feel proud of what had been accomplished. Let herself believe that one person, armed with nothing but truth and stubborn courage, could actually change things. Because she had. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably, undeniably, she had made a difference. And in the morning, she would wake up and do it again. This story was never really about a CEO, a hospital, or even a crime. It was about how easily the world learns to ignore suffering when that suffering happens to people without power, about how dangerous silence becomes when it's accepted as normal. Thomas Whitmore almost died not just because of poison in his water, but because systems had insulated him from truth. For years, warnings existed in fragments, sick communities, delayed environmental reports, uneasy instincts that something wasn't right. Each warning was small enough to dismiss individually. Together, they were lethal. But the voice that finally broke through didn't belong to an expert, a politician, or an executive. It belonged to a young woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Sarah didn't save a life because she was brave in some Hollywood way. She saved a life because she refused to let suffering become background noise. She carried a jar of water, not as evidence initially, but as memory. Of a mother, lost. Of a system that looked away. Of a truth that wouldn't let her rest. Her courage wasn't loud or dramatic. It was persistent. And persistence, in a world designed to exhaust the vulnerable, is a revolutionary act. This story reminds us that justice rarely arrives fully formed. It comes slowly, pushed forward by people who choose discomfort over silence. People who speak when speaking costs them. People who stand when standing means standing alone. It asks us to examine where we place our trust and who we allow to speak. It asks those with power to listen before it's too late, and it asks those without power to believe that their voices still matter, that their stories deserve to be heard, that their lives have value that no one can diminish. Healing, too, doesn't happen instantly. Thomas survived, but survival demanded humility, required him to face how his ambition and exhaustion had created space for harm. Institutions changed, but only because someone disrupted their comfortable silence. Lives were honored not with speeches, but with systems rebuilt to protect the vulnerable. That's what real accountability looks like: slow, imperfect, but moving nonetheless. If this story has moved you, I want to ask you something important. Where in your own life have you seen truth ignored because it came from someone deemed unimportant? When have you witnessed suffering dismissed as inevitable? What would it look like to listen differently? To pay attention to the voices we're trained to overlook? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're invitations to reflection, to action, to becoming the kind of person who doesn't look away. This channel exists to tell stories like Sarah's, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, stories about courage that costs everything, stories about justice that takes time but finally arrives. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe they need to be told and retold until we finally learn their lessons, then I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels powerless, someone who's wondering if speaking up makes any difference. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Your engagement, your willingness to pass these stories along, that's what keeps them alive. That's what turns individual courage into collective movement. Sarah's story started with one jar of water and one person who refused to give up. It grew because other people, Dr. Morrison, Helen, Margaret, Thomas himself, chose to listen, chose to act, chose truth over comfort. You're part of that chain now. You've heard Sarah's story. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you remember it? Share it? Let it change how you see suffering and silence? Or will you let it fade into the background noise of 1,000 stories consumed and forgotten? I hope you'll choose to remember. Hope you'll choose to act. And I hope you'll come back again and again as we tell more stories about people who changed the world, not because they were powerful, but because they refused to be silent. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. From wherever you are, whatever you're facing, know that your voice matters, your courage matters, and sometimes, when you think you're standing alone, you're actually standing with countless others who are finally ready to be heard. Now go. Speak your truth, listen to others, change what needs changing, and come back here when you need to remember why it matters. We'll be waiting.